Rich old farmer named Huss has inherited great wealth of manure and by diligence has added to it. It is double-starred in Baedeker. The Black Forest artist paints it his masterpiece. The king comes to see it. Gretchen Huss, daughter and heiress. Paul Hock, young neighbor, suitor for Gretchen's hand. Ostensibly, he really wants the manure. Hock has a good many cartloads of the Black Forest currency himself, and therefore is a good catch. But he is sordid, mean, and without sentiment, whereas Gretchen is all sentiment and poetry. Hans Schmidt, young neighbor, full of sentiment, full of poetry, loves Gretchen. Gretchen loves him, but he has no manure. Old Huss forbids him in the house. His heart breaks, he goes away to die in the woods, far from the cruel world, for he says bitterly, "What is man without manure?" Interval of 6 months. Paul Hock comes to old Huss and says, "I am at last as rich as you required, come and view the pile." Old Huss views it and says, "It is sufficient, take her and be happy," meaning Gretchen. Interval of 2 weeks. Wedding party assembled in old Huss's drawing room. Hock placid and content, Gretchen weeping over her hard fate. Enter old Huss's head bookkeeper. Huss says fiercely, "I gave you 3 weeks to find out why your books don't balance and to prove that you are not a defaulter. The time is up. Find me the missing property or you go to prison as a thief." Bookkeeper, "I have found it." Where? Bookkeeper sternly, tragically, "In the bridegroom's pile. Behold the thief, see him blench and tremble." Paul Hock, lost, lost, falls over the cow in a swoon and is handcuffed. Gretchen saved, falls over the calf in a swoon of joy, but is caught in the arms of Hans Schmidt, who springs in at that moment. Old Huss, "What, you here, varlet? Unhand the maid and quit the place." Hans, still supporting the insensible girl, "Never, cruel old man, know that I come with claims which even you cannot despise." Huss, "What? Name them." Hans, "Listen then. The world has forsaken me, I forsook the world, I wandered in the solitude of the forest, longing for death but finding none. I fed upon roots, and in my bitterness I dug for the bitterest, loathing the sweeter kind. Digging 3 days agon, I struck a manure mine, a Golconda, a limitless bonanza of solid manure. I can buy you all, and have mountain ranges of manure left. Ha ha, now thou smilest a smile. Immense sensation. Exhibition of specimens from the mine. Old Huss enthusiastically, "Wake her up, shake her up, noble young man, she is yours." Wedding takes place on the spot. Bookkeeper restored to his office and emoluments. Paul Hock led off to jail. The bonanza king of the Black Forest lives to a good old age, blessed with the love of his wife and of his 27 children, and the still sweeter envy of everybody around. We took our noon meal of fried trout one day at the Plough Inn, in a very pretty village, Ottenhofen, and then went into the public room to rest and smoke. There we found 9 or 10 Black Forest grandees assembled around a table. They were the common council of the parish. They had gathered there at 8 o'clock that morning to elect a new member, and they had now been drinking beer 4 hours at the new member's expense. They were men of 50 or 60 years of age, with grave, good-natured faces, and were all dressed in the costume made familiar to us by the Black Forest stories. Broad, round-topped black felt hats with the brims curled up all round, long red waistcoats with large metal buttons, black alpaca coats, with the waists up between the shoulders. There were no speeches, there was but little talk, there were no frivolities. The council filled themselves gradually, steadily, but surely with beer, and conducted themselves with sedate decorum, as became men of position, men of influence, men of manure. We had a hot afternoon tramp up the valley, along the grassy bank of a rushing stream of clear water, past farmhouses, watermills, and no end of wayside crucifixes and saints and virgins. These crucifixes, etc., are set up in memory of departed friends by survivors, and are almost as frequent as telegraph poles are in other lands. We followed the carriage road, and had our usual luck. We traveled under a beating sun, and always saw the shade leave the shady places before we could get to them. In all our wanderings, we seldom managed to strike a piece of road at its time for being shady. We had a particularly hot time of it on that particular afternoon, and with no comfort but what we could get out of the fact that the peasants at work away up on the steep mountainsides above our heads were even worse off than we were. By and by it became impossible to endure the intolerable glare and heat any longer, So he struck across the ravine and entered the deep, cool twilight of the forest to hunt for what the guidebook called the old road. He found an old road, and it proved eventually to be the right one, though we followed it at the time with the conviction that it was the wrong one. If it was the wrong one, there could be no use in hurrying. Therefore we did not hurry, but sat down frequently on the soft moss and enjoyed the restful quiet and shade of the forest solitudes. There had been distractions in the carriage road, school children, peasants, wagons, troops of pedestrianizing students from all over Germany, but we had the old road to ourselves. Now and then, while we rested, we watched the laborious ant at his work. I found nothing new in him, certainly nothing to change my opinion of him. It seems to me that in the matter of intellect the ant must be a strangely overrated bird. During many summers now I have watched him when I ought to have been in better business, and I have not yet come across a living ant that seemed to have any more sense than a dead one. I refer to the ordinary ant, of course. I have had no experience of those wonderful Swiss and African ones which vote, keep drilled armies, hold slaves, and dispute about religion. Those particular ants may be all that the naturalist paints them, but I am persuaded that the average ant is a sham. I admit his industry, of course. He is the hardest-working creature in the world when anybody is looking, but his leather-headedness is the point I make against him. He goes out foraging, he makes a capture, and then what does he do? Go home? No, he goes anywhere but home. He doesn't know where home is. His home may be only 3 feet away, no matter, he can't find it. He makes his capture, as I have said. It is generally something which can be of no sort of use to himself or anybody else. It is usually 7 times bigger than it ought to be. He hunts out the awkwardest place to take hold of it. He lifts it bodily up in the air by main force and starts, not toward home, but in the opposite direction. Not calmly and wisely, but with a frantic haste which is wasteful of his strength. He fetches up against a pebble, and instead of going around it, he climbs over it backward, dragging his booty after him, tumbles down on the other side, jumps up in a passion, kicks the dust off his clothes, moistens his hands, grabs his property viciously, yanks it this way, then that, shoves it ahead of him a moment, turns tail and lugs it after him another moment, gets madder and madder, then presently hoists it into the air and goes tearing away in an entirely new direction, comes to a weed. It never occurs to him to go around it. No, he must climb it. And he does climb it, dragging his worthless property to the top, which is as bright a thing to do as it would be for me to carry a sack of flour from Heidelberg to Paris by way of Strasbourg steeple. When he gets up there, he finds that that is not the place, takes a cursory glance at the scenery, and either climbs down again or tumbles down and starts off once more, as usual, in a new direction. At the end of half an hour, he fetches up within 6 inches of the place he started from and lays his burden down. Meantime, he has been over all the ground for 2 yards around and climbed all the weeds and pebbles he came across. Now he wipes the sweat from his brow, strokes his limbs, and then marches aimlessly off in as violently a hurry as ever. He does not remember to have ever seen it before. He looks around to see which is not the way home, grabs his bundle and starts. He goes through the same adventures he had before, finally stops to rest, and a friend comes along. Evidently the friend remarks that a last year's grasshopper leg is a very noble acquisition and inquires where he got it. Evidently the proprietor does not remember exactly where he did get it, but thinks he got it around here somewhere. Evidently the friend contracts to help him freight it home. Then, with a judgment peculiarly antic, pun not intended, they take hold of opposite ends of that grasshopper leg and begin to tug with all their might in opposite directions. Presently they take a rest and confer together. They decide that something is wrong, they can't make out what. Then they go at it again just as before, same result. Mutual recriminations follow. Evidently each accuses the other of being an obstructionist. They lock themselves together and chew each other's jaws for a while. Then they roll and tumble on the ground till one loses a horn or a leg and has to haul off for repairs. They make up and go to work again in the same old insane way, but the crippled ant is at a disadvantage. Tug as he may, the other one drags off the booty and him at the end of it. Instead of giving up, he hangs on and gets his shins bruised against every obstruction that comes in the way. By and by, when that grasshopper leg has been dragged all over the same old ground once more, it is finally dumped at about the spot where it originally lay. The 2 perspiring ants inspect it thoughtfully and decide that dried grasshopper legs are poor sort of property after all. and then each starts off in a different direction to see if he can't find an old nail or something else that is heavy enough to afford entertainment, and at the same time valueless enough to make an ant want to own it. There in the Black Forest, on the mountainside, I saw an ant go through with such a performance as this with a dead spider of fully 10 times his own weight. The spider was not quite dead, but too far gone to resist. He had a round body the size of a pea. The little ant, observing that I was noticing, turned him on his back, sunk his fangs into his throat, lifted him into the air, and started vigorously off with him, stumbling over little pebbles, stepping on the spider's legs, and tripping himself up, dragging him backward, shoving him bodily ahead, dragging him up stones 6 inches high instead of going around them, climbing weeds 20 times his own height and jumping from their summits, and finally leaving him in the middle of the road to be confiscated by any other fool of an ant that wanted him. I measured the ground which this ass traversed and arrived at the conclusion that what he had accomplished inside of 20 minutes would constitute some such job as this, relatively speaking, for a man, to wit, to strap 2 800-pound horses together, carry them 1,800 feet, mainly over, not around boulders, averaging 6 feet high, and in the course of the journey climb up and jump from the top of one precipice like Niagara and 3 steeples, each 120 feet high, and then put the horses down in an exposed place without anybody to watch them, and go off to indulge in some other idiotic miracle for vanity's sake. Science has recently discovered that the ant does not lay up anything for winter use. This will knock him out of literature to some extent. He does not work except when people are looking, and only then when the observer has a green, naturalistic look and seems to be taking notes. This amounts to deception and will injure him for the Sunday schools. He has not judgment enough to know what is good to eat from what is. This amounts to ignorance and will impair the world's respect for him. He cannot stroll around a stump and find his way home again. This amounts to idiocy, and once the damaging fact is established, thoughtful people will cease to look up to him, the sentimental will cease to fondle him. His vaunted industry is but a vanity and of no effect, since he never gets home with anything he starts with. This disposes of the last remnant of his reputation and wholly destroys his main usefulness as a moral agent, since it will make the sluggard hesitate to go to him any more. It is strange, beyond comprehension, that so manifest a humbug as the ant has been able to fool so many nations and keep it up so many ages without being found out. The ant is strong, but we saw another strong thing, where we had not suspected the presence of much muscular power before. A toadstool, that vegetable which springs to full growth in a single night, had torn loose and lifted a matted mass of pine needles and dirt of twice its own bulk into the air, and supported it there, like a column supporting a shed. 10,000 toadstools, with the right purchase, could lift a man, I suppose, but what good would it do? All our afternoon's progress had been uphill. About 5 or half past, we reached the summit, and all of a sudden the dense curtain of the forest parted, and we looked down into a deep and beautiful gorge, and out over a wide panorama of wooded mountains, with their summits shining in the sun, and their glade-furrowed sides dimmed with purple shade. The gorge under our feet, called Allerheiligen, afforded room in the grassy level at its head for a cozy and delightful human nest, shut away from the world and its botherations, and consequently the monks of the old times had not failed to spy it out. And here were the brown and comely ruins of their church and convent, to prove that priests had as fine an instinct 700 years ago in ferreting out the choicest nooks and corners in a land as priests have today. A big hotel crowds the ruins a little now and drives a brisk trade with summer tourists. We descended into the gorge and had a supper which would have been very satisfactory if the trout had not been boiled. The Germans are pretty sure to boil a trout or anything else if left to their own devices. This is an argument of some value in support of the theory that they were the original colonists of the wild islands of the coast of Scotland. A schooner laden with oranges was wrecked upon one of those islands a few years ago, and the gentle savages rendered the captain such willing assistance that he gave them as many oranges as they wanted. Next day he asked them how they liked them. They shook their heads and said, "Baked they were tough, and even boiled they warn't things for a hungry man to hanker after." We went down the glen after supper. It is beautiful, a mixture of sylvan loveliness and craggy wildness. A limpid torrent goes whistling down the glen, and toward the foot of it winds through a narrow cleft between lofty precipices and hurls itself over a succession of falls. After one passes the last of these, he has a backward glimpse at the falls, which is very pleasing. They rise in a 7-stepped stairway of foamy and glittering cascades, and make a picture which is as charming as it is unusual. Chapter 23. Nicodemus, Dodge, and the Skeleton. We were satisfied that we could walk to Oppenau in one day, now that we were in practice, so we set out the next morning after breakfast determined to do it. It was all the way downhill, and we had the loveliest summer weather for it. So we set the pedometer, and then stretched away on an easy, regular stride down through the cloven forest, drawing in the fragrant breath of the morning in deep, refreshing draughts, and wishing we might never have anything to do forever but walk to Oppenau and keep on doing it, and then doing it over again. Now the true charm of pedestrianism does not lie in the walking, or in the scenery, but in the talking. The walking is good to time the movement of the tongue by, and to keep the blood and the brain stirred up and active. The scenery and the woodsy smells are good to bear in upon a man an unconscious and unobtrusive charm and solace to eye and soul and sense, but the supreme pleasure comes from the talk. It is no matter whether one talks wisdom or nonsense. The case is the same. The bulk of the enjoyment lies in the wagging of the gladsome jaw and the flapping of the sympathetic ear. And what motley variety of subjects a couple of people will casually rake over in the course of a day's tramp. There being no constraint, a change of subject is always in order, and so a body is not likely to keep pegging at a single topic until it grows tiresome. We discussed everything we knew during the first 15 or 20 minutes that morning, and then branched out into the glad, free, boundless realm of the things we were not certain about. Harris said that if the best writer in the world once got the slovenly habit of doubling up his halves, he could never get rid of it while he lived. That is to say, if a man gets the habit of saying, "I should have liked to have known more about it," instead of saying simply and sensibly, "I should have liked to know more about it," that man's disease is incurable. Harris said that his sort of lapse is to be found in every copy of every newspaper that has ever been printed in English, and in almost all of our books. He said he had observed it in Kirkham's Grammar and in Macaulay. Harris believed that milk teeth are commoner in men's mouths than those doubled-up halves. I do not know that there have not been moments in the course of the present session when I should have been very glad to have accepted the proposal of my noble friend, and to have exchanged parts in some of our evenings of work. From a speech of the English Chancellor of the Exchequer, August 1879. That changed the subject to dentistry. I said I believed the average man dreaded tooth-pulling more than amputation, and that he would yell quicker under the former operation than he would under the latter. The philosopher Harris said that the average man would not yell in either case if he had an audience. Then he continued. When our brigade first went into camp on the Potomac, we used to be brought up standing, occasionally, by an ear-splitting howl of anguish. That meant that a soldier was getting a tooth pulled in a tent, but the surgeons soon changed that. They instituted open-air dentistry. There never was a howl afterward, that is, from the man who was having the tooth pulled. At the daily dental hour, there would always be about 500 soldiers gathered together in the neighborhood of that dental chair waiting to see the performance and help. And the moment the surgeon took a grip on the candidate's tooth and began to lift, every one of those 500 rascals would clap his hand to his jaw and begin to hop around on one leg and howl with all the lungs he had. It was enough to raise your hair to hear that variegated and enormous unanimous caterwaul burst out. With so big and so derisive an audience as that, a sufferer wouldn't emit a sound though you pulled his head off. The surgeons said that pretty often a patient was compelled to laugh in the midst of his pangs, but that they had never caught one crying out after the open-air exhibition was instituted. Dental surgeons suggested doctors, doctors suggested death, death suggested skeletons. And so, by a logical process, the conversation melted out of one of these subjects and into the next, until the topic of skeletons raised up Nicodemus Dodge out of the deep grave in my memory where he had lain buried and forgotten for 25 years. When I was a boy in a printing office in Missouri, a loose-jointed, long-legged, tow-headed, jeans-clad, countrified cub of about 16 lounged in one day, and without removing his hands from the depths of his trousers' pockets or taking off his faded ruin of a slouch hat, whose broken rim hung limp and ragged about his eyes and ears like a bug-eaten cabbage leaf, stared indifferently around, then leaned his hip against the editor's table, crossed his mighty brogans, aimed at a distant fly from a crevice in his upper teeth, laid him low, and said with composure, "Where's the boss?" "I am the boss," said the editor, following this curious bit of architecture wonderingly along up to its clock face with his eye. "Don't want anybody fur to learn the business, 'tain't likely." "Well, I don't know, would you like to learn it?" "Pap so po, he can't run me no mo, so I want to get a show summers if I kin. 'Tain't no difference what, I'm strong and hearty, and I don't turn my back on no kind of work, hard nor soft." "Do you think you would like to learn the printing business?" "Well, I don't really care a dern what I do learn, so's I get a chance fur to make my way. I'd just as soon learn printin's anything." "Can you read?" "Yes, middlin'." "Right. Well, I've seed people could lay over me thar." "Cipher." "Not good enough to keep store, I don't reckon, but up as fur as 12 times 12, I ain't no slouch. T'other side of that is what gets me." "Where is your home?" "I'm from Old Shelby." "What's your father's religious denomination?" "Oh, he's a blacksmith." No, I don't mean his trade. What's his religious denomination?" "Oh, I didn't understand you before. He's a Freemason." No, you don't get my meaning yet. What I mean is, does he belong to any church?" "Now you're talkin', couldn't make out what you was a-tryin' to get through yo' head no way. Belong to a church? Why, boss, he's been the pisinest kind of Free Will Baptist for 40 year. They ain't no pisiner ones, and what he is. Mighty good man, Pap is. Everybody says that. If they said any different, they wouldn't say it where I was. Not much they wouldn't." "What is your own religion?" "Well, boss, you've kind-o got me there, and yet you hain't got me so mighty much nother. I think if a feller heaps another feller when he's in trouble, and don't cuss, and don't do no mean things, ner nothin' he ain't no business to do, and don't spell the Savior's name with a little g, he ain't runnin' no risks. He's about as safe as he belonged to a church." "But suppose he did spell it with a little g, what then?" "Well, if he done it a purpose, I reckon he wouldn't stand no chance. He oughtn't to have no chance, anyway. I'm most rotten certain 'bout that." "What is your name?" "Nicodemus Dodge." "I think maybe you'll do, Nicodemus. We'll give you a trial anyway." "All right. When would you like to begin?" "Now." So within 10 minutes, after we had first glimpsed this nondescript, he was one of us, and with his coat off and hard at it. Beyond that end of our establishment, which was furthest from the street, was a deserted garden, pathless and thickly grown with the bloomy and villainous Jimpson weed and its common friend, the stately sunflower. In the midst of this mournful spot was a decayed and aged little frame house with but one room, one window, and no ceiling. It had been a smokehouse a generation before. Nicodemus was given this lonely and ghostly den as a bedchamber. The village smarties recognized a treasure in Nicodemus right away, a butt to play jokes on. It was easy to see that he was inconceivably green and confiding. George Jones had the glory of perpetrating the first joke on him. He gave him a cigar with a firecracker in it and winked to the crowd to come. The thing exploded presently and swept away the bulk of Nicodemus's eyebrows and eyelashes. He simply said, "I consider them kind of cigars dangersome," and seemed to suspect nothing. The next evening Nicodemus waylaid George and poured a bucket of ice water over him. One day, while Nicodemus was in swimming, Tom McElroy tied his clothes. Nicodemus made a bonfire of Tom's by way of retaliation. A third joke was played upon Nicodemus a day or two later. He walked up the middle aisle of the village church, Sunday night, with a staring handbill pinned between his shoulders. The joker spent the remainder of the night, after church, in the cellar of a deserted house, and Nicodemus sat on the cellar door till toward breakfast time to make sure that the prisoner remembered that if any noise was made, some rough treatment would be the consequence. The cellar had 2 feet of stagnant water in it and was bottomed with 6 inches of soft mud. But I wander from the point. It was the subject of skeletons that brought this boy back to my recollection. Before a very long time had elapsed, the village smarties began to feel an uncomfortable consciousness of not having made a very shining success out of their attempts on the simpleton from Old Shelby. Experimenters grew scarce and chary. Now the young doctor came to the rescue. There was delight and applause when he proposed to scare Nicodemus to death and explained how he was going to do it. He had a noble new skeleton, the skeleton of the late and only local celebrity, Jimmy Finn, the village drunkard, a grisly piece of property which he had bought of Jimmy Finn himself, at auction, for $50, under great competition, when Jimmy lay very sick in the tan yard a fortnight before his death. The $50 had gone promptly for whiskey and had considerably hurried up the change of ownership in the skeleton. The doctor would put Jimmy Finn's skeleton in Nicodemus's bed. This was done about 10:30 in the evening. About Nicodemus's usual bedtime, midnight, the village jokers came creeping stealthily through the Jimpson weeds and sunflowers toward the lonely frame den. They reached the window and peeped in. There sat the long-legged pauper on his bed in a very short shirt and nothing more. He was dangling his legs contentedly back and forth and wheezing the music of Camptown races out of a paper-overlaid comb which he was pressing against his mouth. By him lay a new Jew-sharp, a new top, and solid India-rubber bowl, a handful of painted marbles, 5 pounds of store candy, and a well-gnawed slab of gingerbread as big and as thick as a volume of sheet music. He had sold the skeleton to a traveling quack for $3 and was enjoying the result. Just as we had finished talking about skeletons and were drifting into the subject of fossils, Harris and I heard a shout and glanced up the steep hillside. We saw men and women standing away up there looking frightened, and there was a bulky object tumbling and floundering down the steep slope toward us. We got out of the way, and when the object landed in the road, it proved to be a boy. He had tripped and fallen, and there was nothing for him to do but trust to luck and take what might come. When one starts to roll down a place like that, there is no stopping till the bottom is reached. Think of people farming on a slant which is so steep that the best you can say of it, if you want to be fastidiously accurate, is that it is a little steeper than a ladder and not quite so steep as a mansard roof. But that is what they do. Some of the little farms on the hillside opposite Heidelberg were stood up edgeways. The boy was wonderfully jolted up, and his head was bleeding from cuts which it had got from small stones on the way. Harris and I gathered him up and set him on a stone, and by that time the men and women had scampered down and brought his cap. Men, women, and children flocked out from neighboring cottages and joined the crowd. The pale boy was petted and stared at and commiserated, and water was brought for him to drink and bathe his bruises in. And such another clatter of tongues. All who had seen the catastrophe were describing it at once, and each trying to talk louder than his neighbor. And one youth of a superior genius ran a little way up the hill, called attention, tripped, fell, rolled down among us, and thus triumphantly showed exactly how the thing had been done. Harris and I were included in all the descriptions, how we were coming along, how Hans Gross shouted, how we looked up startled, how we saw Peter coming like a cannon shot, how judiciously we got out of the way and let him come, and with what presence of mind we picked him up and brushed him off and set him on a rock when the performance was over. We were as much heroes as anybody else, except Peter, and were so recognized. We were taken with Peter and the populace to Peter's mother's cottage, and there we ate bread and cheese and drank milk and beer with everybody and had a most sociable good time. And when we left, we had a handshake all around and were receiving and shouting back Lebby Woles until a turn in the road separated us from our cordial and kindly new friends forever. We accomplished our undertaking. At 8:30 in the evening, we stepped into Oppenau, just 11 hours and a half out of Allerheiligen, 146 miles. This is the distance by pedometer. The guidebook and the imperial ordnance maps make it only 10 1/4, a surprising blunder, for these two authorities are usually singularly accurate in the matter of distances. Chapter 24. I protect the Empress of Germany. That was a thoroughly satisfactory walk, and the only one we were ever to have, which was all the way downhill. We took the train next morning and returned to Baden-Baden through fearful fogs of dust. Every seat was crowded too, for it was Sunday, and consequently everybody was taking a pleasure excursion. Hot. The sky was an oven, and a sound one too, with no cracks in it to let in any air. An odd time for a pleasure excursion, certainly. Sunday is the great day on the continent, the free day, the happy day. One can break the Sabbath in 100 ways without committing any sin. We do not work on Sunday because the commandment forbids it. The Germans do not work on Sunday because the commandment forbids it. We rest on Sunday because the commandment requires it. The Germans rest on Sunday because the commandment requires it. But in the definition of the word rest lies all the difference. With us, its Sunday meaning is stay in the house and keep still. With the Germans, its Sunday and weekday meanings seem to be the same. Rest the tired part, and never mind the other parts of the frame. Rest the tired part, and use the means best calculated to rest that particular part. Thus, if one's duties have kept him in the house all the week, it will rest him to be out on Sunday. If his duties have required him to read weighty and serious matter all the week, it will rest him to read light matter on Sunday. If his occupation has busied him with death and funerals all the week, it will rest him to go to the theater Sunday night and put in 2 or 3 hours laughing at a comedy. If he is tired with digging ditches or felling trees all the week, it will rest him to lie quiet in the house on Sunday. If the hand, the arm, the brain, the tongue, or any other member is fatigued with inanition, it is not to be rested by adding a day's inanition. But if a member is fatigued with exertion, inanition is the right rest for it. Such is the way in which the Germans seem to define the word rest. That is to say, they rest a member by recreating, recuperating, restoring its forces. But our definition is less broad. We all rest alike on Sunday, by secluding ourselves and keeping still, whether that is the surest way to rest the most of us or not. The Germans make the actors, the preachers, etc., work on Sunday. We encourage the preachers, the editors, the printers, etc., to work on Sunday and imagine that none of the sin of it falls upon us. But I do not know how we are going to get around the fact that if it is wrong for the printer to work at his trade on Sunday, it must be equally wrong for the preacher to work at his, since the commandment has made no exception in his favor. We buy Monday morning's paper and read it, and thus encourage Sunday printing. But I shall never do it again. The Germans remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy by abstaining from work as commanded. We keep it holy by abstaining from work as commanded, and by also abstaining from play, which is not commanded. Perhaps we constructively break the command to rest, because the resting we do is in most cases only a name and not a fact. These reasonings have sufficed, in a measure, to mend the rent in my conscience, which I made by traveling to Baden-Baden that Sunday. We arrived in time to furbish up and get to the English church before services began. We arrived in considerable style too, for the landlord had ordered the first carriage that could be found, since there was no time to lose, and our coachman was so splendidly liveried that we were probably mistaken for a brace of stray dukes. Why else were we honored with a pew all to ourselves, away up among the very elect, at the left of the chancel? That was my first thought. In the pew directly in front of us sat an elderly lady, plainly and cheaply dressed. At her side sat a young lady with a very sweet face, and she also was quite simply dressed. But around us and about us were clothes and jewels which it would do anybody's heart good to worship in. I thought it was pretty manifest that the elderly lady was embarrassed at finding herself in such a conspicuous place arrayed in such cheap apparel. I began to feel sorry for her and troubled about her. She tried to seem very busy with her prayer book and her responses, and unconscious that she was out of place, but I said to myself, she is not succeeding. There is a distressed tremulousness in her voice which betrays increasing embarrassment. Presently the Saviour's name was mentioned, and in her flurry she lost her head completely, and rose and courtesied, instead of making a slight nod as everybody else did. The sympathetic blood surged to my temples, and I turned and gave those fine birds what I intended to be a beseeching look, but my feelings got the better of me and changed it into a look which said, "If any of you pets of fortune laugh at this poor soul, you will deserve to be flayed for it." Things went from bad to worse, and I shortly found myself mentally taking the unfriended lady under my protection. My mind was wholly upon her. I forgot all about the sermon. Her embarrassment took stronger and stronger hold upon her. She got to snapping the lid of her smelling bottle. It made a loud, sharp sound, but in her trouble she snapped and snapped away, unconscious of what she was doing. The last extremity was reached when the collection plate began its rounds. The moderate people threw in pennies, the nobles and the rich contributed silver, but she laid a 20-mark gold piece upon the bookrest before her with a sounding slap. I said to myself, she has parted with all her little hoard to buy the consideration of these unpitying people. It is a sorrowful spectacle. I did not venture to look around this time, but as the service closed, I said to myself, let them laugh, it is their opportunity, but at the door of this church they shall see her step into our fine carriage with us, and our gaudy coachman shall drive her home. Then she rose, and all the congregation stood while she walked down the aisle. She was the Empress of Germany. No, she had not been so much embarrassed as I had supposed. My imagination had got started on the wrong scent, and that is always hopeless. One is sure, then, to go straight on misinterpreting everything, clear through to the end. The young lady with her imperial majesty was a maid of honor, and I had been taking her for one of her boarders all the time. This is the only time I have ever had an empress under my personal protection, and considering my inexperience, I wonder I got through with it so well. I should have been a little embarrassed myself if I had known earlier what sort of a contract I had on my hands. We found that the Empress had been in Baden-Baden several days. It is said that she never attends any but the English form of church service. I lay abed and read and rested from my journeys, fatigues the remainder of that Sunday, but I sent my agent to represent me at the afternoon service, for I never allow anything to interfere with my habit of attending church twice every Sunday. There was a vast crowd in the public grounds that night to hear the band play the Fremmersburg. This piece tells one of the old legends of the region, how a great noble of the Middle Ages got lost in the mountains and wandered about with his dogs in a violent storm, until at last the faint tones of a monastery bell, calling the monks to a midnight service, caught his ear, and he followed the direction the sounds came from and was saved. A beautiful air ran through the music, without ceasing, sometimes loud and strong, sometimes so soft that it could hardly be distinguished, but it was always there. It swung grandly along through the shrill whistling of the storm wind, the rattling patter of the rain, and the boom and crash of the thunder. It wound soft and low through the lesser sounds, the distant ones, such as the throbbing of the convent bell, the melodious winding of the hunter's horn, the distressed bayings of his dogs, and the solemn chanting of the monks. It rose again with a jubilant ring and mingled itself with the country songs and dances of the peasants assembled in the convent hall to cheer up the rescued huntsman while he ate his supper. The instruments imitated all these sounds with a marvelous exactness. More than one man started to raise his umbrella when the storm burst forth, and the sheets of mimic rain came driving by. It was hardly possible to keep from putting your hand to your hat when the fierce wind began to rage and shriek, and it was not possible to refrain from starting when those sudden and charmingly real thunder crashes were let loose. I suppose the Fremmersburg is a very low-grade music. I know indeed that it must be low-grade music, because it delighted me, warmed me, moved me, stirred me, uplifted me, enraptured me, that I was full of cry all the time and mad with enthusiasm. My soul had never had such a scouring out since I was born. The solemn and majestic chanting of the monks was not done by instruments, but by men's voices, and it rose and fell, and rose again in that rich confusion of warring sounds and pulsing bells and the stately swing of that ever-present enchanting air. And it seemed to me that nothing but the very lowest of low-grade music could be so divinely beautiful. The great crowd which the Fremmersburg had called out was another evidence that it was low-grade music, for only the few are educated up to a point where high-grade music gives pleasure. I have never heard enough classic music to be able to enjoy it. I dislike the opera because I want to love it and can't. I suppose there are two kinds of music, one kind which one feels, just as an oyster might, and another sort which requires a higher faculty, a faculty which must be assisted and developed by teaching. Yet if bass music gives certain of us wings, why should we want any other? But we do. We want it because the higher and better like it. We want it without giving it the necessary time and trouble, so we climb into that upper tier, that dress circle, by a lie. We pretend we like it. I know several of that sort of people, and I propose to be one of them myself when I get home with my fine European education. And then there is painting. What a red rag is to a bull, Turner's slave ship was to me before I studied art. Mr. Ruskin is educated in art up to a point where that picture throws him into as mad an ecstasy of pleasure as it used to throw me into one of rage last year when I was ignorant. His cultivation enables him, and me, now to see water in that glaring yellow mud, and natural effects in those lurid explosions of mixed smoke and flame, and crimson sunset glories. It reconciles him and me now to the floating of iron cable chains and other unfloatable things. It reconciles us to fishes swimming around on top of the mud. I mean the water. The most of the picture is a manifest impossibility, that is to say, a lie, and only rigid cultivation can enable a man to find truth in a lie. But it enabled Mr. Ruskin to do it, and it has enabled me to do it, and I am thankful for it. A Boston newspaper reporter went and took a look at the slave ship floundering about in that fierce conflagration of reds and yellows, and said it reminded him of a tortoiseshell cat having a fit in a platter of tomatoes. In my then uneducated state, that went home to my non-cultivation, and I thought, here is a man with an unobstructed eye. Mr. Ruskin would have said, this person is an ass. That is what I would say now. Months after this was written, I happened into the National Gallery in London, and soon became so fascinated with the Turner pictures that I could hardly get away from the place. I went there often afterward, meaning to see the rest of the gallery, but the Turner spell was too strong. It could not be shaken off. However, the Turners which attracted me most did not remind me of the slave ship. However, our business in Baden-Baden this time was to join our courier. I had thought it best to hire one, as we should be in Italy by and by, and we did not know the language, neither did he. We found him at the hotel, ready to take charge of us. I asked him if he was all fixed. He said he was. That was very true. He had a trunk, 2 small satchels, and an umbrella. I was to pay him $55 a month and railway fares. On the continent, the railway fare on a trunk is about the same it is on a man. Couriers do not have to pay any board and lodging. This seems a great saving to the tourist at first. It does not occur to the tourist that somebody pays that man's board and lodging. It occurs to him by and by, however, in one of his lucid moments. Chapter 25. Hunted by the Little Chamois. Next morning we left in the train for Switzerland and reached Lucerne about 10 o'clock at night. The first discovery I made was that the beauty of the lake had not been exaggerated. Within a day or two I made another discovery. This was that the lauded chamois is not a wild goat, that it is not a horned animal, that it is not shy, that it does not avoid human society, and that there is no peril in hunting it. The chamois is a black or brown creature no bigger than a mustard seed. You do not have to go after it, it comes after you. It arrives in vast herds and skips and scampers all over your body, inside your clothes. Thus it is not shy, but extremely sociable. It is not afraid of man. On the contrary, it will attack him. Its bite is not dangerous, but neither is it pleasant. Its activity has not been overstated. If you try to put your finger on it, it will skip 1,000 times its own length at one jump, and no eye is sharp enough to see where it lights. A great deal of romantic nonsense has been written about the Swiss chamois and the perils of hunting it, whereas the truth is that even women and children hunt it, and fearlessly. Indeed, everybody hunts it. The hunting is going on all the time, day and night, in bed and out of it. It is poetic foolishness to hunt it with a gun. Very few people do that. There is not one man in a million who can hit it with a gun. It is much easier to catch it than it is to shoot it, and only the experienced chamois hunter can do either. Another common piece of exaggeration is that about the scarcity of the chamois. It is the reverse of scarce. Droves of 100 million chamois are not unusual in the Swiss hotels. Indeed, they are so numerous as to be a great pest. The romancers always dress up the chamois hunter in a fanciful and picturesque costume, whereas the best way to hunt this game is to do it without any costume at all. The article of commerce called chamois skin is another fraud. Nobody could skin a chamois, it is too small. The creature is a humbug in every way, and everything which has been written about it is sentimental exaggeration. It was no pleasure to me to find the chamois out, for he had been one of my pet illusions. All my life it had been my dream to see him in his native wilds someday and engage in the adventurous sport of chasing him from cliff to cliff. It is no pleasure to me to expose him now and destroy the reader's delight in him and respect for him, but still it must be done. For when an honest writer discovers an imposition, it is his simple duty to strip it bare and hurl it down from its place of honor, no matter who suffers by it. Any other course would render him unworthy of the public confidence. Lucerne is a charming place. It begins at the water's edge, with a fringe of hotels, and scrambles up and spreads itself over 2 or 3 sharp hills in a crowded, disorderly but picturesque way, offering to the eye a heaped-up confusion of red roofs, quaint gables, dormer windows, toothpick steeples, with here and there a bit of ancient embattled wall bending itself over the ridges, worm fashion, and here and there an old square tower of heavy masonry, and also here and there a town clock with only one hand, a hand which stretches across the dial and has no joint in it. Such a clock helps out the picture, but you cannot tell the time of day by it. Between the curving line of hotels and the lake is a broad avenue with lamps and a double rank of low shade trees. The lakefront is walled with masonry like a pier and has a railing to keep people from walking overboard. All day long the vehicles dash along the avenue, and nurses, children and tourists sit in the shade of the trees or lean on the railing and watch the schools of fishes darting about in the clear water, or gaze out over the lake at the stately border of snow-hooded mountain peaks. Little pleasure steamers, black with people, are coming and going all the time, and everywhere one sees young girls and young men paddling about in fanciful rowboats, or skimming along by the help of sails when there is any wind. The front rooms of the hotels have little railed balconies, where one may take his private luncheon in calm, cool comfort and look down upon this busy and pretty scene, and enjoy it without having to do any of the work connected with it. Most of the people, both male and female, are in walking costume and carry alpenstocks. Evidently, it is not considered safe to go about in Switzerland, even in town, without an alpenstock. If the tourist forgets and comes down to breakfast without his alpenstock, he goes back and gets it and stands it up in the corner. When his touring in Switzerland is finished, he does not throw that broomstick away, but lugs it home with him to the far corners of the earth, although this costs him more trouble and bother than a baby or a courier could. You see, the alpenstock is his trophy, his name is burned upon it, and if he has climbed a hill or jumped a brook or traversed a brickyard with it, he has the names of those places burned upon it too. Thus it is his regimental flag, so to speak, and bears the record of his achievements. It is worth 3 francs when he buys it, but a bonanza could not purchase it after his great deeds have been inscribed upon it. There are artisans all about Switzerland whose trade it is to burn these things upon the alpenstock of the tourist. And observe, a man is respected in Switzerland according to his alpenstock. I found I could get no attention there while I carried an unbranded one. However, branding is not expected, so I soon remedied that. The effect upon the next detachment of tourists was very marked. I felt repaid for my trouble. Half of the summer horde in Switzerland is made up of English people. The other half is made up of many nationalities, the Germans leading and the Americans coming next. The Americans were not as numerous as I had expected they would be. The 7:30 table d'hôte at the Great Schweizerhof furnished a mighty array and variety of nationalities, but it offered a better opportunity to observe costumes than people, for the multitude sat at immensely long tables, and therefore the faces were mainly seen in perspective. But the breakfasts were served at small round tables, and then, if one had the fortune to get a table, in the midst of the assemblage he could have as many faces to study as he could desire. We used to try to guess out the nationalities, and generally succeeded tolerably well. Sometimes we tried to guess people's names, but that was a failure. That is a thing which probably requires a good deal of practice. We presently dropped it and gave our efforts to less difficult particulars. One morning I said, There is an American party. Harris said. Yes, but name the state. I named one state, Harris named another. We agreed upon one thing, however, that the young girl with the party was very beautiful and very tastefully dressed, but we disagreed as to her age. I said she was 18, Harris said she was 20. The dispute between us waxed warm, and I finally said, with a pretense of being in earnest, well, there is one way to settle the matter. I will go and ask her. Harris said sarcastically, certainly, that is the thing to do. All you need to do is to use the common formula over here. Go and say, I'm an American. Of course she will be glad to see you. Then he hinted that perhaps there was no great danger of my venturing to speak to her. I said I was only talking. I didn't intend to approach her, but I see that you do not know what an intrepid person I am. I am not afraid of any woman that walks. I will go and speak to this young girl. The thing I had in my mind was not difficult. I meant to address her in the most respectful way and ask her to pardon me if her strong resemblance to a former acquaintance of mine was deceiving me, and when she should reply that the name I mentioned was not the name she bore, I meant to beg pardon again, most respectfully, and retire. There would be no harm done. I walked to her table, bowed to the gentleman, then turned to her, and was about to begin my little speech when she exclaimed. I knew I wasn't mistaken. I told John it was you. John said it probably wasn't, but I knew I was right. I said you would recognize me presently and come over, and I'm glad you did, for I shouldn't have felt much flattered if you had gone out of this room without recognizing me. Sit down, sit down. How odd it is. You are the last person I was ever expecting to see again. This was a stupefying surprise. It took my wits clear away for an instant. However, we shook hands cordially all around, and I sat down. But truly this was the tightest place I ever was in. I seemed to vaguely remember the girl's face now, but I had no idea where I had seen it before or what name belonged with it. I immediately tried to get up a diversion about Swiss scenery to keep her from launching into topics that might betray that I did not know her, but it was of no use. She went right along upon matters which interested her more. Oh dear, what a night that was, when the sea washed the forward boats away. Do you remember it? Oh, don't I, said I, but I didn't. I wished the sea had washed the rudder and the smokestack and the captain away, then I could have located this questioner. And don't you remember how frightened poor Mary was, and how she cried? Indeed I do, said I, dear me, how it all comes back. I fervently wished it would come back, but my memory was a blank. The wise way would have been to frankly own up, but I could not bring myself to do that after the young girl had praised me so for recognizing her. So I went on, deeper and deeper into the mire, hoping for a chance clue, but never getting one. The unrecognizable continued with vivacity. Do you know George married Mary, after all? Why, no, did he? Indeed he did. He said he did not believe she was half as much to blame as her father was, and I thought he was right, didn't you? Of course he was. It was a perfectly plain case. I always said so. Why, no, you did, at least that summer. Oh no, not that summer. No, you are perfectly right about that. It was the following winter that I said it. Well, as it turned out, Mary was not in the least to blame. It was all her father's fault, at least his and old Darley's. It was necessary to say something, so I said. I always regarded Darley as a troublesome old thing. So he was, but then they always had a great affection for him, although he had so many eccentricities. You remember that when the weather was the least cold, he would try to come into the house. I was rather afraid to proceed. Evidently Darley was not a man. He must be some other kind of animal, possibly a dog, maybe an elephant. However, tails are common to all animals, so I ventured to say. And what a tail he had! One, he had 1,000. This was bewildering. I did not quite know what to say, so I only said. Yes, he was rather well fixed in the matter of tails. For a Negro, and a crazy one at that, I should say he was, said she. It was getting pretty sultry for me. I said to myself, is it possible she is going to stop there and wait for me to speak? If she does, the conversation is blocked. A Negro with 1,000 tales is a topic which a person cannot talk upon fluently and instructively without more or less preparation, as to diving rashly into such a vast subject. But here, to my gratitude, she interrupted my thoughts by saying, yes, when it came to tales of his crazy woes, there was simply no end to them if anybody would listen. His own quarters were comfortable enough, but when the weather was cold, the family were sure to have his company. Nothing could keep him out of the house. But they always bore it kindly because he had saved Tom's life years before. You remember Tom? Oh, perfectly. Fine fellow he was, too. Yes, he was, and what a pretty little thing his child was. You may well say that. I never saw a prettier child. I used to delight to pet it and dandle it and play with it. So did I. You named it. What was that name? I can't call it to mind. It appeared to me that the ice was getting pretty thin here. I would have given something to know what the child's was. However, I had the good luck to think of a name that would fit either sex, so I brought it out. I named it Frances. From a relative, I suppose, but you named the one that died, too, one that I never saw. What did you call that one? I was out of neutral names, but as the child was dead and she had never seen it, I thought I might risk a name for it and trust to luck. Therefore I said, I called that one Thomas Henry. She said musingly, that is very singular, very singular. I sat still and let the cold sweat run down. I was in a good deal of trouble, but I believed I could worry through if she wouldn't ask me to name any more children. I wondered where the lightning was going to strike next. She was still ruminating over that last child's title, but presently she said, I have always been sorry you were away at the time. I would have had you name my child. Your child? Are you married? I have been married 13 years. Christened, you mean? No, married. The youth by your side is my son. It seems incredible, even impossible. I do not mean any harm by it, but would you mind telling me if you are any over 18? That is to say, will you tell me how old you are? I was just 19 the day of the storm we were talking about. That was my birthday. That did not help matters much, as I did not know the date of the storm. I tried to think of some noncommittal thing to say to keep up my end of the talk and render my poverty in the matter of reminiscences as little noticeable as possible, but I seemed to be about out of noncommittal things. I was about to say, you haven't changed a bit since then, but that was risky. I thought of saying, you have improved ever so much since then, but that wouldn't answer, of course. I was about to try a shy at the weather for a saving change when the girl slipped in ahead of me and said, how I have enjoyed this talk over those happy old times, haven't you? I never have spent such a half-hour in all my life before, said I, with emotion, and I could have added, with a near approach to truth, and I would rather be scalped than spend another one like it. I was holily grateful to be through with the ordeal and was about to make my goodbyes and get out, when the girl said, but there is one thing that is ever so puzzling to me. Why, what is that? That dead child's name, what did you say it was? Here was another balmy place to be in. I had forgotten the child's name. I hadn't imagined it would be needed again. However, I had to pretend to know anyway, so I said, Joseph William. The youth at my side corrected me and said, no, Thomas Henry. I thanked him in words and said with trepidation, oh yes, I was thinking of another child that I named. I have named a great many, and I get them confused. This one was named Henry Thompson. Thomas Henry, calmly interposed the boy. I thanked him again, strictly in words, and stammered out, Thomas Henry, yes, Thomas Henry was the poor child's name. I named him for Thomas Carlyle, the great author, you know, and Henry VIII. The parents were very grateful to have a child named Thomas Henry. That makes it more singular than ever, murmured my beautiful friend. Does it? Why? Because when the parents speak of that child now, they always call it Susan Amelia. That spiked my gun. I could not say anything. I was entirely out of verbal obliquities. To go further would be to lie, and that I would not do. So I simply sat still and suffered, sat mutely and resignedly there, and sizzled, for I was being slowly fried to death in my own blushes. Presently the enemy laughed a happy laugh and said, "I have enjoyed this talk over old times, but you have not. I saw very soon that you were only pretending to know me, and so as I had wasted a compliment on you in the beginning, I made up my mind to punish you, and I have succeeded pretty well. I was glad to see that you knew George and Tom and Darley, for I had never heard of them before and therefore could not be sure that you had, and I was glad to learn the names of those imaginary children too. One can get quite a fund of information out of you if one goes at it cleverly. Mary and the storm and the sweeping away of the forward boats were facts, all the rest was fiction. Mary was my sister. Her full name was Mary. Now do you remember me?" "Yes," I said, "I do remember you now, and you are as hard-headed as you were 13 years ago in that ship, else you wouldn't have punished me so. You haven't changed your nature nor your person in any way at all. You look as young as you did then, you're just as beautiful as you were then, and you have transmitted a deal of your comeliness to this fine boy. There, if that speech moves you any, let's fly the flag of truce, with the understanding that I am conquered and confess it." All of which was agreed to and accomplished on the spot. When I went back to Harris, I said, "Now you see what a person with talent and address can do." "Excuse me, I see what a person of colossal ignorance and simplicity can do. The idea of your going and intruding on a party of strangers, that way, and talking for half an hour. Why, I never heard of a man in his right mind doing such a thing before. What did you say to them?" "I never said any harm. I merely asked the girl what her name was." "I don't doubt it. Upon my word I don't. I think you were capable of it. It was stupid in me to let you go over there and make such an exhibition of yourself. But you know, I couldn't really believe you would do such an inexcusable thing. What will those people think of us? But how did you say it? I mean the manner of it. I hope you were not abrupt." "No, I was careful about that. I said, 'My friend and I would like to know what your name is, if you don't mind.' No, that was not abrupt. There is a polish about it that does you infinite credit, and I am glad you put me in. That was a delicate attention which I appreciate at its full value. What did she do?" "She didn't do anything in particular. She told me her name." "Simply told you her name. Do you mean to say she did not show any surprise?" "Well, now I come to think, she did show something. Maybe it was surprise. I hadn't thought of that. I took it for gratification." "Oh, undoubtedly you were right. It must have been gratification. It could not be otherwise than gratifying to be assaulted by a stranger with such a question as that. Then what did you do?" "I offered my hand, and the party gave me a shake." "I saw it. I did not believe my own eyes at the time. Did the gentlemen say anything about cutting your throat?" "No, they all seemed glad to see me, as far as I could judge." "And do you know, I believe they were. I think they said to themselves, 'Doubtless this curiosity has got away from his keeper, let us amuse ourselves with him.' There is no other way of accounting for their facile docility. You sat down. Did they ask you to sit down?" "No, they did not ask me, but I suppose they did not think of it." "You have an unerring instinct. What else did you do? What did you talk about?" "Well, I asked the girl how old she was." "Undoubtedly, your delicacy is beyond praise. Go on, don't mind my apparent misery. I always look so when I am steeped in a profound and reverent joy." "Go on, she told you her age." "Yes, she told me her age, and all about her mother and her grandmother and her other relations, and all about herself." "Did she volunteer these statistics?" "No, not exactly that. I asked the questions and she answered them." "This is divine. Go on. It is not possible that you forgot to inquire into her politics." "No, I thought of that. She is a Democrat, her husband is a Republican, and both of them are Baptists." "Her husband, is that child married?" "She is not a child. She is married, and that is her husband who is there with her." Has she any children? Yes, 7.5. That is impossible. No, she has them. She told me herself. Well, but 7.5, how do you make out the half? Where does the half come in? There is a child which she had by another husband, not this one but another one, so it is a stepchild, and they do not count in full measure. Another husband, has she another husband? Yes, 4, this one is number 4. I don't believe a word of it, it is impossible, upon its face. Is that boy there her brother? No, that is her son, he is her youngest, he is not as old as he looked, he is only 11.5. These things are all manifestly impossible. This is a wretched business. It is a plain case. They simply took your measure and concluded to fill you up. They seem to have succeeded. I am glad I am not in the mess. They may at least be charitable enough to think there ain't a pair of us. Are they going to stay here long? No, they leave before noon. There is one man who is deeply grateful for that. How did you find out? You asked, I suppose. No, along at first I inquired into their plans, in a general way, and they said they were going to be here a week, and make trips round about. But toward the end of the interview, when I said you and I would tour around with them with pleasure, and offered to bring you over and introduce you, they hesitated a little, and asked if you were from the same establishment that I was. I said you were, and then they said they had changed their mind, and considered it necessary to start at once, and visit a sick relative in Siberia. On me you struck the summit. You struck the loftiest altitude of stupidity that human effort has ever reached. You shall have a monument of jackasses, skulls as high as the Strasbourg spire if you die before I do. They wanted to know I was from the same establishment that you hailed from, did they? What did they mean by establishment? I don't know, it never occurred to me to ask. Well, I know, they meant an asylum, an idiot asylum, do you understand? So they do think there's a pair of us, after all. Now what do you think of yourself? Well, I don't know. I didn't know I was doing any harm. I didn't mean to do any harm. They were very nice people, and they seemed to like me. Harris made some rude remarks and left for his bedroom to break some furniture, he said. He was a singularly irascible man. Any little thing would disturb his temper. I had been well scorched by the young woman, but no matter, I took it out on Harris. One should always get even in some way, else the sore place will go on hurting. P. 257, 11K. Chapter 26. The Nest of the Cuckoo Clock. The Hofkirche is celebrated for its organ concerts. All summer long, the tourists flock to that church about 6 o'clock in the evening and pay their franc and listen to the noise. They don't stay to hear all of it, but get up and tramp out over the sounding stone floor, meeting late comers who tramp in a sounding and vigorous way. This tramping back and forth is kept up nearly all the time, and is accented by the continuous slamming of the door, and the coughing and barking and sneezing of the crowd. Meantime, the big organ is booming and crashing and thundering away, doing its best to prove that it is the biggest and best organ in Europe, and that a tight little box of a church is the most favorable place to average and appreciate its powers in. It is true, there were some soft and merciful passages occasionally, but the tramp of the tourists only allowed one to get fitful glimpses of them, so to speak. Then right away the organist would let go another avalanche. The commerce of Lucerne consists mainly in gimcrackery of the souvenir sort. The shops are packed with alpine crystals, photographs of scenery, and wooden and ivory carvings. I will not conceal the fact that miniature figures of the Lion of Lucerne are to be had in them, millions of them, but they are libels upon him, every one of them. There is a subtle something about the majestic pathos of the original which the copyist cannot get. Even the sun fails to get it. Both the photographer and the carver give you a dying lion, and that is all. The shape is right, the attitude is right, the proportions are right, but that indescribable something which makes the Lion of Lucerne the most mournful and moving piece of stone in the world is wanting. The lion lies in his lair in the perpendicular face of a low cliff, for he is carved from the living rock of the cliff. His size is colossal, his attitude is noble, his head is bowed, the broken spear is sticking in his shoulder, His protecting paw rests upon the lilies of France. Vines hang down the cliff and wave in the wind, and a clear stream trickles from above and empties into a pond at the base, and in the smooth surface of the pond the lion is mirrored among the water lilies. Around about are green trees and grass. The place is a sheltered, reposeful woodland nook, remote from noise and stir and confusion, and all this is fitting, for lions do die in such places, and not on granite pedestals in public squares fenced with fancy iron railings. The Lion of Lucerne would be impressive anywhere, but nowhere so impressive as where he is. Martyrdom is the luckiest fate that can befall some people. Louis Roman XVI did not die in his bed, consequently history is very gentle with him. She is charitable toward his failings, and she finds in him high virtues which are not usually considered to be virtues when they are lodged in kings. She makes him out to be a person with a meek and modest spirit, the heart of a female saint, and a wrong head. None of these qualities are kingly, but the last. Taken together, they make a character which would have fared harshly at the hands of history if its owner had had the ill luck to miss martyrdom. With the best intentions to do the right thing, he always managed to do the wrong one. Moreover, nothing could get the female saint out of him. He knew well enough that in national emergencies he must not consider how he ought to act as a man, but how he ought to act as a king. So he honestly tried to sink the man and be the king, but it was a failure. He only succeeded in being the female saint. He was not instant in season, but out of season. He could not be persuaded to do a thing while it could do any good. He was iron, he was adamant in his stubbornness then, but as soon as the thing had reached a point where it would be positively harmful to do it he would, and nothing could stop him. He did not do it because it would be harmful, but because he hoped it was not yet too late to achieve by it the good which it would have done if applied earlier. His comprehension was always a train or two behindhand. If a national toe required amputating, he could not see that it needed anything more than poulticing. When others saw that the mortification had reached the knee, he first perceived that the toe needed cutting off, so he cut it off, and he severed the leg at the knee. When others saw that the disease had reached the thigh, he was good and honest and well-meaning in the matter of chasing national diseases, but he never could overtake one. As a private man, he would have been lovable, but viewed as a king, he was strictly contemptible. His was a most unroyal career, but the most pitiable spectacle in it was his sentimental treachery to his Swiss guard on that memorable 10th of August, when he allowed those heroes to be massacred in his cause, and forbade them to shed the sacred French blood, purporting to be flowing in the veins of the red-capped mob of miscreants that was raging around the palace. He meant to be kingly, but he was only the female saint once more. Some of his biographers think that upon this occasion the spirit of St. Louis had descended upon him. It must have found pretty cramped quarters. If Napoleon I had stood in the shoes of Louis Roman XVI that day, instead of being merely a casual and unknown looker-on, there would be no Lion of Lucerne now, but there would be a well-stocked communist graveyard in Paris, which would answer just as well to remember the 10th of August by. Martyrdom made a saint of Mary Queen of Scots 300 years ago, and she has hardly lost all of her saintship yet. Martyrdom made a saint of the trivial and foolish Marie Antoinette, and her biographers still keep her fragrant with the odor of sanctity to this day, while unconsciously proving upon almost every page they write that the only calamitous instinct which her husband lacked, she supplied, the instinct to root out and get rid of an honest, able, and loyal official, wherever she found him. The hideous but beneficent French Revolution would have been deferred, or would have fallen short of completeness, or even might not have happened at all, if Marie Antoinette had made the unwise mistake of not being born. The world owes a great deal to the French Revolution, and consequently to its two chief promoters, Louis the Poor in spirit and his queen. We did not buy any wooden images of the lion, nor any ivory or ebony or marble or chalk or sugar or chocolate ones, or even any photographic slanders of him. The truth is, these copies were so common, so universal, in the shops and everywhere, that they presently became as intolerable to the wearied eye as the latest popular melody usually becomes to the harassed ear. In Lucerne, too, the wood carvings of other sorts, which had been so pleasant to look upon when one saw them occasionally at home, soon began to fatigue us. We grew very tired of seeing wooden quails and chickens picking and strutting around clock faces, and still more tired of seeing wooden images of the alleged chamois skipping about wooden rocks, or lying upon them in family groups, or peering alertly up from behind them. The first day I would have bought 150 of these clocks if I had the money, and I did buy 3, but on the third day the disease had run its course, I had convalesced, and was in the market once more trying to sell. However, I had no luck, which was just as well, for the things will be pretty enough, no doubt, when I get them home. For years my pet aversion had been the cuckoo clock. Now here I was at last, right in the creature's home, so wherever I went that distressing hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo was always in my ears. For a nervous man, this was a fine state of things. Some sounds are hatefuler than others, but no sound is quite so inane and silly and aggravating as the hoo-hoo of a cuckoo clock, I think. I bought one and am carrying it home to a certain person, for I have always said that if the opportunity ever happened, I would do that man an ill turn. What I meant was that I would break one of his legs or something of that sort, but in Lucerne I instantly saw that I could impair his mind. That would be more lasting and more satisfactory every way. So I bought the cuckoo clock, and if I ever get home with it, he is my meat, as they say in the mines. I thought of another candidate, a book reviewer whom I could name if I wanted to, but after thinking it over, I didn't buy him a clock. I couldn't injure his mind. We visited the 2 long, covered wooden bridges, which span the green and brilliant Reuss, just below where it goes plunging and hurrahing out of the lake. These rambling, swayback tunnels are very attractive things, with their alcoved outlooks upon the lovely and inspiriting water. They contain 200 or 300 queer old pictures by old Swiss masters, old boss sign painters, who flourished before the decadence of art. The lake is alive with fishes, plainly visible to the eye, for the water is very clear. The parapets in front of the hotels were usually fringed with fishers of all ages. One day I thought I would stop and see a fish caught. The result brought back to my mind, very forcibly, a circumstance which I had not thought of before for 12 years. This one. The man who put up at Gadsby's. When my odd friend Riley and I were newspaper correspondents in Washington in the winter of '67, we were coming down Pennsylvania Avenue one night, near midnight, in a driving storm of snow, when the flash of a street lamp fell upon a man who was eagerly tearing along in the opposite direction. "This is lucky. You are Mr. Riley, ain't you?" Riley was the most self-possessed and solemnly deliberate person in the Republic. He stopped, looked his man over from head to foot, and finally said, "I am Mr. Riley. Did you happen to be looking for me?" "That's just what I was doing," said the man joyously, "and it's the biggest luck in the world that I've found you. My name is Likens. I'm one of the teachers of the high school, San Francisco. As soon as I heard the San Francisco postmastership was vacant, I made up my mind to get it, and here I am." "Yes," said Riley slowly, "as you have remarked, Mr. Likens, here you are, and have you got it?" "Well, not exactly got it, but the next thing to it. I've brought a petition, signed by the Superintendent of Public Instruction and all the teachers, and by more than 200 other people. Now I want you, if you'll be so good, to go around with me to the Pacific delegation, for I want to rush this thing through and get along home. If the matter is so pressing, you will prefer that we visit the delegation tonight," said Riley, in a voice which had nothing mocking in it, to an unaccustomed ear. "Oh, tonight, by all means. I haven't got any time to fool around. I want their promise before I go to bed. I ain't the talking kind, I'm the doing kind." "Yes, you've come to the right place for that. When did you arrive?" "Just an hour ago." "When are you intending to leave?" "For New York tomorrow evening, for San Francisco next morning." "Just so. What are you going to do tomorrow?" "Do? Why, I've got to go to the president with the petition and the delegation, and get the appointment, haven't I?" "Yes, very true, that is correct. And then what?" "Executive session of the Senate at 2 p.m. Got to get the appointment confirmed. I reckon you'll grant that." "Yes, yes," said Riley meditatively. "You are right again. Then you take the train for New York in the evening and the steamer for San Francisco next morning." "That's it, that's the way I map it out." Riley considered a while, and then said, "You couldn't stay a day, well, say 2 days longer." "Bless your soul, no, it's not my style. I ain't a man to go fooling around. I'm a man that does things I tell you." The storm was raging, the thick snow blowing in gusts. Riley stood silent, apparently deep in a reverie. During a minute or more, then he looked up and said, "Have you ever heard about that man who put up at Gadsby's once? But I see you haven't." He backed Mr. Likens against an iron fence, buttonholed him, fastened him with his eye like the ancient mariner, and proceeded to unfold his narrative as placidly and peacefully as if we were all stretched comfortably in a blossomy summer meadow, instead of being persecuted by a wintry midnight tempest. "I will tell you about that man. It was in Jackson's time. Gadsby's was the principal hotel then. Well, this man arrived from Tennessee about 9 o'clock one morning with a black coachman and a splendid 4-horse carriage and an elegant dog, which he was evidently fond of and proud of. He drove up before Gadsby's, and the clerk and the landlord and everybody rushed out to take charge of him, but he said, 'Never mind,' and jumped out and told the coachman to wait. Said he hadn't time to take anything to eat. He only had a little claim against the government to collect, would run across the way to the treasury and fetch the money, and then get right along back to Tennessee, for he was in considerable of a hurry. Well, about 11 o'clock that night, he came back and ordered a bed and told them to put the horses up, said he would collect the claim in the morning. This was in January, you understand, January 1834, the 3d of January, Wednesday. Well, on the 5th of February, he sold the fine carriage and bought a cheap second-hand one, said it would answer just as well to take the money home in, and he didn't care for style. On the 11th of August, he sold a pair of the fine horses, said he'd often thought a pair was better than 4, to go over the rough mountain roads, with where a body had to be careful about his driving, and there wasn't so much of his claim, but he could lug the money home with a pair easy enough. On the 13th of December, he sold another horse, said 2 weren't necessary to drag that old light vehicle with. In fact, one could snatch it along faster than was absolutely necessary, now that it was good solid winter weather and the roads in splendid condition. On the 17th of February, 1835, he sold the old carriage and bought a cheap second-hand buggy, said a buggy was just the trick to skim along mushy, slushy early spring roads with, and he had always wanted to try a buggy on those mountain roads anyway. On the 1st August, he sold the buggy and bought the remains of an old sulky, said he just wanted to see those green Tennesseans stare and gawk when they saw him come a-ripping along in a sulky, didn't believe they'd ever heard of a sulky in their lives. Well, on the 29th of August, he sold his colored coachman, said he didn't need a coachman for a sulky, wouldn't be room enough for 2 in it anyway, and besides, it wasn't every day that Providence sent a man a fool who was willing to pay $900 for such a third-rate Negro as that, been wanting to get rid of the creature for years, but didn't like to throw him away. 18 months later, that is to say, on the 15th of February, 1837, he sold the sulky and bought a saddle, said horseback riding was what the doctor had always recommended him to take, and dogged if he wanted to risk his neck going over those mountain roads on wheels in the dead of winter, not if he knew himself. On the 9th of April, he sold the saddle, said he wasn't going to risk his life with any perishable saddle girth that ever was made over a rainy, miry April road, while he could ride bareback and know and feel he was safe. Always had despised to ride on a saddle anyway. On the 24th of April, he sold his horse, said, "I'm just 57 today, hale and hearty. It would be a pretty howdy-do for me to be wasting such a trip as that, and such weather as this, on a horse, when there ain't anything in the world so splendid as a tramp on foot through the fresh spring woods and over the cheery mountains to a man that is a man, and I can make my dog carry my claim in a little bundle anyway when it's collected. So tomorrow I'll be up bright and early, make my little old collection, and mosey off to Tennessee on my own hind legs with a rousing goodbye to Gadsby's." On the 22d of June, he sold his dog, said "Durn a dog anyway," where you're just starting off on a rattling bully pleasure tramp through the summer woods and hills. Perfect nuisance. Chases the squirrels, barks at everything, goes a-capering and splattering around in the fords. Man can't get any chance to reflect and enjoy nature, and I'd a blamed sight rather carry the claim myself. It's a mighty sight safer. A dog's mighty uncertain in a financial way, always noticed it. Well, goodbye, boys, last call. I'm off for Tennessee with a good leg and a gay heart early in the morning. There was a pause and a silence, except the noise of the wind and the pelting snow. Mr. Likens said, impatiently, "Well." Riley said, "Well, that was 30 years ago." Very well, what of it?" "I'm great friends with that old patriarch. He comes every evening to tell me goodbye. I saw him an hour ago. He's off for Tennessee early tomorrow morning, as usual. Said he calculated to get his claim through and be off before night owls like me have turned out of bed." The tears were in his eyes. He was so glad he was going to see his old Tennessee and his friends once more. Another silent pause. The stranger broke it. "Is that all?" "That is all." "Well, for the time of night, and the kind of night, it seems to me the story was full long enough. But what's it all for?" "Oh, nothing in particular." "Well, where's the point of it?" "Oh, there isn't any particular point to it. Only, if you are not in too much of a hurry to rush off to San Francisco with that post office appointment, Mr. Likens, I'd advise you to put up at Gadsby's for a spell and take it easy. Goodbye, God bless you." So saying, Riley blandly turned on his heel and left the astonished schoolteacher standing there, a musing and motionless snow image shining in the broad glow of the street lamp. He never got that post office. To go back to Lucerne and its fishers, I concluded, after about 9 hours waiting, that the man who proposes to tarry till he sees something hook one of those well-fed and experienced fishes will find it wisdom to put up at Gadsby's and take it easy. It is likely that a fish has not been caught on that lake pier for 40 years, but no matter, the patient fisher watches his cork there all the day long, just the same, and seems to enjoy it. One may see the fisher loafers just as thick and contented and happy and patient all along the Seine at Paris, but tradition says that the only thing ever caught there in modern times is a thing they don't fish for at all: the recent dog and the translated cat. Chapter 27. I spare an awful boor. Close by the Lion of Lucerne is what they call the Glacier Garden, and it is the only one in the world. It is on high ground. 4 or 5 years ago, some workmen who were digging foundations for a house came upon this interesting relic of a long-departed age. Scientific men perceived in it a confirmation of their theories concerning the glacial period. So through their persuasions, the little tract of ground was bought and permanently protected against being built upon. The soil was removed, and there lay the rasped and guttered track which the ancient glacier had made as it moved along upon its slow and tedious journey. This track was perforated by huge pot-shaped holes in the bedrock, formed by the furious washing around in them of boulders by the turbulent torrent which flows beneath all glaciers. These huge round boulders still remain in the holes. They and the walls of the holes are worn smooth by the long-continued chafing which they gave each other in those old days. It took a mighty force to churn these big lumps of stone around in that vigorous way. The neighboring country had a very different shape at that time. The valleys have risen up and become hills since, and the hills have become valleys. The boulders discovered in the pots had traveled a great distance, for there is no rock like them nearer than the distant Rhone glacier. For some days we were content to enjoy looking at the blue Lake Lucerne and at the piled-up masses of snow mountains that border it all around. An enticing spectacle, this last, for there is a strange and fascinating beauty and charm about a majestic snow peak with the sun blazing upon it or the moonlight softly enriching it. But finally we concluded to try a bit of excursioning around on a steamboat and a dash on foot at the Rigi. Very well, we had a delightful trip to Fleulen on a breezy, sunny day. Everybody sat on the upper deck, on benches, under an awning. Everybody talked, laughed, and exclaimed at the wonderful scenery. In truth, a trip on that lake is almost the perfection of pleasuring. The mountains were a never-ceasing marvel. Sometimes they rose straight up out of the lake and towered aloft and overshadowed our pygmy steamer with their prodigious bulk in the most impressive way. Not snow-clad mountains, these, yet they climbed high enough toward the sky to meet the clouds and veil their foreheads in them. They were not barren and repulsive, but clothed in green and restful and pleasant to the eye. And they were so almost straight up and down, sometimes, that one could not imagine a man being able to keep his footing upon such a surface. Yet there are paths, and the Swiss people go up and down them every day. Sometimes one of these monster precipices had the slight inclination of the huge shiphouses in dockyards. Then high aloft, toward the sky, it took a little stronger inclination, like that of a mansard roof, and perched on this dizzy mansard one's eye detected little things like martin boxes, and presently perceived that these were the dwellings of peasants, an airy place for a home, truly. And suppose a peasant should walk in his sleep, or his child should fall out of the front yard. The friends would have a tedious long journey down out of those cloud heights before they found the remains. And yet those faraway homes looked ever so seductive. They were so remote from the troubled world. They dozed in such an atmosphere of peace and dreams. Surely no one who has learned to live up there would ever want to live on a meaner level. We swept through the prettiest little curving arms of the lake, among these colossal green walls, enjoying new delights always, as the stately panorama unfolded itself before us and re-rolled and hid itself behind us. And now and then we had the thrilling surprise of bursting suddenly upon a tremendous white mass like the distant and dominating Jungfrau, or some kindred giant, looming head and shoulders above a tumbled waste of lesser Alps. Once, while I was hungrily taking in one of these surprises and doing my best to get all I possibly could of it while it should last, I was interrupted by a young and carefree voice. "You're an American, I think, Sam I." He was about 18, or possibly 19, slender and of medium height, open, frank, happy face, a restless but independent eye, a snub nose, which had the air of drawing back with a decent reserve from the silky newborn mustache below it until it should be introduced, a loosely hung jaw, calculated to work easily in the sockets. He wore a low-crowned, narrow-brimmed straw hat, with a broad blue ribbon around it which had a white anchor embroidered on it in front, knobby short-tailed coat, pantaloons, vest, all trim and neat and up with the fashion, red striped stockings, very low-quarter patent leather shoes tied with black ribbon, blue ribbon around his neck, wide-open collar, tiny diamond studs, wrinkleless kids, projecting cuffs, fastened with large oxidized silver sleeve buttons. Bearing the device of a dog's face, English pug, he carried a slim cane, surmounted with an English pug's head with red glass eyes. Under his arm he carried a German grammar Otto S. His hair was short, straight, and smooth, and presently when he turned his head a moment, I saw that it was nicely parted behind. He took a cigarette out of a dainty box, stuck it into a meerschaum holder which he carried in a morocco case, and reached for my cigar. While he was lighting, I said, "Yes, I am an American." "I knew it, I can always tell them. What ship did you come over in?" "Holstatia." "We came in the Batavia, Cunard, you know. What kind of passage did you have?" "Tolerably rough." "So did we. Captain said he'd hardly ever seen it rougher. Where are you from?" "New England." "Sam, I'm from New Bloomfield. Anybody with you?" "Yes, a friend." "Our whole family's along. It's awful slow going around alone, don't you think so?" "Rather slow." "Ever been over here before?" "Yes." "I haven't, my first trip, but we've been all around Paris and everywhere. I'm to enter Harvard next year, studying German all the time now. Can't enter till I know German. I know considerable French. I get along pretty well in Paris or anywhere where they speak French. What hotel are you stopping at?" "Schweizerhof." "No, is that so? I never see you in the reception room. I go to the reception room a good deal of the time because there's so many Americans there. I make lots of acquaintances. I know an American as soon as I see him, and so I speak to him and make his acquaintance. I like to be always making acquaintances, don't you?" "Lord, yes." "You see, it breaks up a trip like this, first rate. I never got bored on a trip like this, if I can make acquaintances and have somebody to talk to. But I think a trip like this would be an awful bore if a body couldn't find anybody to get acquainted with and talk to on a trip like this. I'm fond of talking, ain't you? Passionately. Have you felt bored on this trip? Not all the time, part of it. That's it, you see, you ought to go around and get acquainted and talk. That's my way. That's the way I always do. I just go round, round, round and talk, talk, talk. I never get bored. You been up the riggy yet? No. Going. I think so. What hotel you going to stop at? I don't know. Is there more than one? 3. You stop at the Schreiber. You'll find it full of Americans. What ship did you say you came over in? City of Antwerp. German, I guess. You going to Geneva? Yes. What hotel you going to stop at? Hotel de l'Écu de Genève. Don't you do it. No Americans there. You stop at one of those big hotels over the bridge. They're packed full of Americans. But I want to practice my Arabic. Good gracious, do you speak Arabic? Yes, well enough to get along. Why, hang it, you won't get along in Geneva. They don't speak Arabic, they speak French. What hotel are you stopping at here? Hotel Pension Borovage. Show, you ought to stop at the Schweizerhof. Didn't you know the Schweizerhof was the best hotel in Switzerland? Look at your Baedeker. Yes, I know, but I had an idea there weren't any Americans there. No Americans? Why, bless your soul, it's just alive with them. I'm in the great reception room most all the time. I make lots of acquaintances there. Not as many as I did at first, because now only the new ones stop in there. The others go right along through. Where are you from? Arkansas. Is that so? I'm from New England. New Bloomfield's my town when I'm at home. I'm having a mighty good time today, ain't you? Divine. That's what I call it. I like this knocking around, loose and easy, and making acquaintances and talking. I know an American soon as I see him, so I go and speak to him and make his acquaintance. I ain't ever bored on a trip like this if I can make new acquaintances and talk. I'm awful fond of talking when I can get hold of the right kind of a person, ain't you? I prefer it to any other dissipation. That's my notion too. Now some people like to take a book and sit down and read and read and read, or moon around yopping at the lake or these mountains and things. But that ain't my way. No, sir, if they like it, let 'em do it, I don't object. But as for me, talking's what I like. You been up the riggy? Yes. What hotel did you stop at? Schreiber. That's the place. I stopped there too, full of Americans, wasn't it? It always is, always is. That's what they say. Everybody says that. What ship did you come over in? Ville de Paris. French, I reckon. What kind of a passage did? Excuse me a minute, there's some Americans I haven't seen before. And away he went. He went uninjured, too. I had the murderous impulse to harpoon him in the back with my alpenstock, but as I raised the weapon the disposition left me. I found I hadn't the heart to kill him. He was such a joyous, innocent, good-natured numbskull. Half an hour later I was sitting on a bench inspecting, with strong interest, a noble monolith which we were skimming by, a monolith not shaped by man, but by nature's free great hand, a massy pyramidal rock 80 feet high, devised by nature 10 million years ago against the day when a man worthy of it should need it for his monument. The time came at last, and now this grand remembrancer bears Schiller's name in huge letters upon its face. Curiously enough, this rock was not degraded or defiled in any way. It is said that 2 years ago a stranger let himself down from the top of it with ropes and pulleys and painted all over it, in blue letters bigger than those in Schiller's name, these words: Try Sazadont. By Sun Stove Polish. Helmbold's Bachu. Try benzoline for the blood. He was captured, and it turned out that he was an American. Upon his trial, the judge said to him, You are from a land where any insolent that wants to is privileged to profane and insult nature, and through her, nature's God, if by so doing he can put a sordid penny in his pocket. But here the case is different. Because you are a foreigner and ignorant, I will make your sentence light. If you were a native, I would deal strenuously with you. Hear and obey. You will immediately remove every trace of your offensive work from the Schiller monument. You pay a fine of 10,000 francs. You will suffer 2 years' imprisonment at hard labor. You will then be horsewhipped, tarred and feathered, deprived of your ears, ridden on a rail to the confines of the canton, and banished forever. The severest penalties are omitted in your case, not as a grace to you, but to that great republic which had the misfortune to give you birth. The steamer's benches were ranged back to back across the deck. My back hair was mingling innocently with the back hair of a couple of ladies. Presently they were addressed by someone, and I overheard this conversation. "You are Americans, I think, Sam I." "Yes, we are Americans." "I knew it, I can always tell them. What ship did you come over in?" "City of Chester." "Oh yes, Inman Line. We came in the Batavia, Cunard, you know. What kind of a passage did you have?" "Pretty fair." "That was luck, we had it awful rough. Captain said he'd hardly seen it rougher. Where are you from?" "New Jersey." "Sam, I know, I didn't mean that. I'm from New England. New Bloomfield's my place. These your children belong to both of you." "Only to one of us. They are mine. My friend is not married." "Single, I reckon. Sam I, are you two ladies traveling alone?" "No, my husband is with us. Our whole family's along. It's awful slow going around alone, don't you think so?" "I suppose it must be." "Hi, there's Mount Pilatus coming in sight again. Named after Pontius Pilate, you know, that shot the apple off of William Tell's head. Guidebook tells all about it, they say. I didn't read it. An American told me. I don't read when I'm knocking around like this, having a good time. Did you ever see the chapel where William Tell used to preach?" "I did not know he ever preached there." "Oh yes, he did. That American told me so. He don't ever shut up his guidebook. He knows more about this lake than the fishes in it. Besides, they call it Tell's Chapel, you know that yourself. You ever been over here before?" "Yes." "I haven't, it's my first trip, but we've been all around Paris and everywhere. I'm to enter Harvard next year, studying German all the time now. Can't enter till I know German. This book's Otto's grammar. It's a mighty good book to get the Ich habe gehabt haben s out of. But I don't really study when I'm knocking around this way. If the notion takes me, I just run over my little old Ich habe gehabt, du hast gehabt, hat gehabt, wir haben gehabt, I haben gehabt, sie haben gehabt. Kind of now I lay me down to sleep fashion, you know, and after that, maybe I don't buckle to it for 3 days. It's awful undermining to the intellect, German is. You want to take it in small doses, or first you know your brains all run together, and you feel them sloshing around in your head, same as so much drawn butter. But French is different. French ain't anything. I ain't any more afraid of French than a tramp's afraid of pie. I can rattle off my little J.I., too, as il a, and the rest of it, just as easy as a BC. I get along pretty well in Paris, or anywhere where they speak French. What hotel are you stopping at?" "The Schweizerhof." "No, is that so? I never see you in the big reception room. I go in there a good deal of the time, because there's so many Americans there. I make lots of acquaintances. You been up the Rigi yet?" "No." "Going. We think of it." "What hotel you going to stop at?" "I don't know." "Well, then you stop at the Schreiber. It's full of Americans. What ship did you come over in?" "City of Chester." "Oh yes, I remember I asked you that before. But I always ask everybody what ship they came over in, and so sometimes I forget and ask again. You going to Geneva?" "Yes." "What hotel you going to stop at?" "We expect to stop in a pension." "I don't hardly believe you'll like that. There's very few Americans in the pensions. What hotel are you stopping at here?" "The Schweizerhof." "Oh yes, I asked you that before too. But I always ask everybody what hotel they're stopping at, and so I've got my head all mixed up with hotels. But it makes talk, and I love to talk. It refreshes me up so, don't it you, on a trip like this? Yes, sometimes. Well, it does me too. As long as I'm talking, I never feel bored. Ain't that the way with you? Yes, generally, but there are exceptions to the rule. Oh, of course, I don't care to talk to everybody myself. If a person starts in to jabber about scenery and history and pictures and all sorts of tiresome things, I get the fantods mighty soon. I say, well, I must be going now, hope I'll see you again, and then I take a walk. Where you from? New Jersey. Why bother it all? I asked you that before too. Have you seen the Lion of Lucerne? Not yet. Nor I either, but the man who told me about Mount Pilatus says it's one of the things to see. It's 28 feet long. It don't seem reasonable, but he said so anyway. He saw it yesterday, said it was dying then, so I reckon it's dead by this time. But that ain't any matter, of course they'll stuff it. Did you say the children are yours or hers? Mine. Oh, so you did. Are you going up the... No, I asked you that. What ship? No, I asked you that too. What hotel are you? No, you told me that. Let me see. Oh, what kind of voy? No, we've been over that ground too. Well, I believe that is all. Bonjour, I am very glad to have made your acquaintance, ladies. Guten Tag. Chapter 28. The Jodel and its native wilds. The Rigicombe is an imposing alpine mass, 6,000 feet high, which stands by itself and commands a mighty prospect of blue lakes, green valleys, and snowy mountains. A compact and magnificent picture 300 miles in circumference. The ascent is made by rail or horseback or on foot, as one may prefer. I and my agent panoplied ourselves in walking costume one bright morning and started down the lake on the steamboat. We got ashore at the village of Wegies, 3/4 of an hour distant from Lucerne. This village is at the foot of the mountain. We were soon tramping leisurely up the leafy mule path, and then the talk began to flow as usual. It was 12 o'clock noon, and a breezy, cloudless day. The ascent was gradual, and the glimpses, from under the curtaining boughs, of blue water and tiny sailboats and beetling cliffs were as charming as glimpses of dreamland. All the circumstances were perfect, and the anticipations, too, for we should soon be enjoying, for the first time, that wonderful spectacle, an alpine sunrise, the object of our journey. There was apparently no real need for hurry, for the guidebook made the walking distance from Wegies to the summit only 3 hours and a quarter. I say apparently because the guidebook had already fooled us once about the distance from Allerheiligen to Oppenau, and for aught I knew, it might be getting ready to fool us again. We were only certain as to the altitudes. We calculated to find out for ourselves how many hours it is from the bottom to the top. The summit is 6,000 feet above the sea, but only 4,500 feet above the lake. When we had walked half an hour, we were fairly into the swing and humor of the undertaking, so we cleared for action. That is to say, we got a boy whom we met to carry our alpenstocks and satchels and overcoats and things for us. That left us free for business. I suppose we must have stopped oftener to stretch out on the grass in the shade and take a bit of a smoke than this boy was used to, for presently he asked if it had been our idea to hire him by the job or by the year. We told him he could move along if he was in a hurry. He said he wasn't in such a very particular hurry, but he wanted to get to the top while he was young. We told him to clear out then and leave the things at the uppermost hotel and say we should be along presently. He said he would secure us a hotel if he could, but if they were all full, he would ask them to build another one and hurry up and get the paint and plaster dry against we arrived. Still gently chaffing us, he pushed ahead, up the trail, and soon disappeared. By 6 o'clock we were pretty high up in the air, and the view of lake and mountains had greatly grown in breadth and interest. We halted a while at a little public house, where we had bread and cheese and a quart or two of fresh milk, out on the porch, with the big panorama all before us, and then moved on again. 10 minutes afterward, we met a hot, red-faced man plunging down the mountain, making mighty strides, swinging his alpenstock ahead of him, and taking a grip on the ground with its iron point to support these big strides. He stopped, fanned himself with his hat, swabbed the perspiration from his face and neck with a red handkerchief, panted a moment or two, and asked how far to Wegies. I said 3 hours. He looked surprised and said, "Why, it seems as if I could toss a biscuit into the lake from here, it's so close by. Is that an inn there?" I said it was. "Well," said he, "I can't stand another 3 hours. I've had enough today. I'll take a bed there." I asked, "Are we nearly to the top?" "Nearly to the top? Why, bless your soul, you haven't really started yet." I said we would put up at the inn, too. So we turned back and ordered a hot supper and had quite a jolly evening of it with this Englishman. The German landlady gave us neat rooms and nice beds, and when I and my agent turned in, it was with the resolution to be up early and make the utmost of our first alpine sunrise. But of course we were dead tired and slept like policemen, so when we awoke in the morning and ran to the window, it was already too late, because it was 11:30. It was a sharp disappointment. However, we ordered breakfast and told the landlady to call the Englishman, but she said he was already up and off at daybreak and swearing like mad about something or other. We could not find out what the matter was. He had asked the landlady the altitude of her place above the level of the lake, and she told him 1,495 feet. That was all that was said. Then he lost his temper. He said that between fools and guidebooks, a man could acquire ignorance enough in 24 hours in a country like this to last him a year. Harris believed our boy had been loading him up with misinformation, and this was probably the case, for his epithet described that boy to a dot. We got underway about the turn of noon and pulled out for the summit again with a fresh and vigorous step. When we had gone about 200 yards and stopped to rest, I glanced to the left while I was lighting my pipe, and in the distance detected a long worm of black smoke crawling lazily up the steep mountain. Of course that was the locomotive. We propped ourselves on our elbows at once to gaze, for we had never seen a mountain railway yet. Presently we could make out the train. It seemed incredible that that thing should creep straight up a sharp slant like the roof of a house, but there it was, and it was doing that very miracle. In the course of a couple hours, we reached a fine breezy altitude where the little shepherd huts had big stones all over their roofs to hold them down to the earth when the great storms rage. The country was wild and rocky about here, but there were plenty of trees, plenty of moss and grass. Away off on the opposite shore of the lake, we could see some villages, and now for the first time we could observe the real difference between their proportions and those of the giant mountains at whose feet they slept. When one is in one of those villages, it seems spacious, and its houses seem high and not out of proportion to the mountain that overhangs them. But from our altitude, what a change! The mountains were bigger and grander than ever, as they stood there thinking their solemn thoughts with their heads in the drifting clouds, but the villages at their feet, when the painstaking eye could trace them up and find them, were so reduced, almost invisible, and lay so flat against the ground, that the exactest simile I can devise is to compare them to ant deposits of granulated dirt overshadowed by the huge bulk of a cathedral. The steamboats skimming along under the stupendous precipices were diminished by distance to the daintiest little toys, the sailboats and rowboats to shallops proper for fairies that keep house in the cups of lilies and ride to court on the backs of bumblebees. Presently we came upon half a dozen sheep nibbling grass in the spray of a stream of clear water that sprang from a rock wall 100 feet high, and all at once our ears were startled with a melodious lull, l-l-l-l-l-l-ahio-o-o, pealing joyously from a near but invisible source, and recognized that we were hearing for the first time the famous alpine jodel in its own native wilds. And we recognized also that it was that sort of quaint commingling of baritone and falsetto which at home we call Tyrolese warbling. The jodeling, pronounced y-odling, emphasis on the o, continued, and was very pleasant and inspiriting to hear. Now the jodeler appeared, a shepherd boy of 16, and in our gladness and gratitude we gave him a franc to jodel some more. So he jodeled, and we listened. We moved on presently, and he generously jodeled us out of sight. After about 15 minutes, we came across another shepherd boy who was jodeling, and gave him half a franc to keep it up. He also jodeled us out of sight. After that we found a jodeler every 10 minutes. We gave the first one 8 cents, the second one 6 cents, the third one 4, the fourth one a penny, contributed nothing to nose. 5, 6, and during the remainder of the day hired the rest of the jodlers at a franc apiece not to jodel any more. There is somewhat too much of the jodeling in the Alps. About the middle of the afternoon, we passed through a prodigious natural gateway called the Felsenther, formed by two enormous upright rocks, with a third lying across the top. There was a very attractive little hotel close by, but our energies were not conquered yet, so we went on. 3 hours afterward, we came to the railway track. It was planted straight up the mountain with the slant of a ladder that leans against a house, and it seemed to us that man would need good nerves who proposed to travel up it or down it either. During the latter part of the afternoon, we cooled our roasting interiors with ice-cold water from clear streams, the only really satisfying water we had tasted since we left home, for at the hotels on the continent, they merely give you a tumbler of ice to soak your water in, and that only modifies its hotness, doesn't make it cold. Water can only be made cold enough for summer comfort by being prepared in a refrigerator or a closed ice pitcher. Europeans say ice water impairs digestion. How do they know? They never drink any. At 6:10, we reached the Kaltbad station, where there is a spacious hotel with great verandas which command a majestic expanse of lake and mountain scenery. We were pretty well fagged out now, but as we did not wish to miss the alpine sunrise, we got through our dinner as quickly as possible and hurried off to bed. It was unspeakably comfortable to stretch our weary limbs between the cool, damp sheets. And how we did sleep, for there is no opiate like alpine pedestrianism. In the morning we both awoke and leaped out of bed at the same instant and ran and stripped aside the window curtains. But we suffered a bitter disappointment again. It was already 3:30 in the afternoon. We dressed sullenly and in ill spirits, each accusing the other of oversleeping. Harris said if we had brought the courier along, as we ought to have done, we should not have missed these sunrises. I said he knew very well that one of us would have to sit up and wake the courier, and I added that we were having trouble enough to take care of ourselves on this climb without having to take care of a courier besides. During breakfast, our spirits came up a little, since we found by this guidebook that in the hotels on the summit, the tourist is not left to trust to luck for his sunrise, but is roused betimes by a man who goes through the halls with a great alpine horn, blowing blasts that would raise the dead. And there was another consoling thing. The guidebook said that up there on the summit the guests did not wait to dress much, but seized a red bed blanket and sailed out arrayed like an Indian. This was good. This would be romantic. 250 people grouped on the windy summit, with their hair flying and their red blankets flapping in the solemn presence of the coming sun, would be a striking and memorable spectacle. So it was good luck, not ill luck, that we had missed those other sunrises. We were informed by the guidebook that we were now 28 feet above the level of the lake, therefore full 2/3 of our journey had been accomplished. We got away at 4:15 p.m. 100 yards above the hotel the railway divided. One track went straight up the steep hill, the other one turned square off to the right, with a very slight grade. We took the latter and followed it more than a mile, turned a rocky corner, and came in sight of a handsome new hotel. If we had gone on, we should have arrived at the summit, but Harris preferred to ask a lot of questions, as usual, of a man who didn't know anything, and he told us to go back and follow the other route. We did so. We could ill afford this loss of time. We climbed and climbed, and we kept on climbing. We reached about 40 summits, but there was always another one just ahead. It came on to rain, and it rained in dead earnest. We were soaked through, and it was bitter cold. Next, a smoky fog of clouds covered the whole region densely, and we took to the railway ties to keep from getting lost. Sometimes we slopped along in a narrow path on the left-hand side of the track, but by and by when the fog blew aside a little, and we saw that we were treading the rampart of a precipice, and that our left elbows were projecting over a perfectly boundless and bottomless vacancy, we gasped and jumped for the ties again. The night shut down, dark and drizzly and cold. About 8 in the evening the fog lifted and showed us a well-worn path which led up a very steep rise to the left. We took it, and as soon as we had got far enough from the railway to render the finding it again an impossibility, the fog shut down on us once more. We were in a bleak, unsheltered place now, and had to trudge right along in order to keep warm, though we rather expected to go over a precipice sooner or later. About 9 o'clock, we made an important discovery that we were not in any path. We groped around a while on our hands and knees, but we could not find it, so we sat down in the mud and the wet scant grass to wait. We were terrified into this by being suddenly confronted with a vast body which showed itself vaguely for an instant, and in the next instant was smothered in the fog again. It was really the hotel we were after, monstrously magnified by the fog, but we took it for the face of a precipice and decided not to try to claw up it. We sat there an hour, with chattering teeth and quivering bodies, and quarreled over all sorts of trifles, but gave most of our attention to abusing each other for the stupidity of deserting the railway track. We sat with our backs to the precipice, because what little wind there was came from that quarter. At some time or other the fog thinned a little. We did not know when, for we were facing the empty universe, and the thinness could not show. But at last Harris happened to look around, and there stood a huge, dim, spectral hotel where the precipice had been. One could faintly discern the windows and chimneys, and a dull blur of lights. Our first emotion was deep, unutterable gratitude. Our next was a foolish rage, born of the suspicion that possibly the hotel had been visible 3/4 of an hour while we sat there in those cold puddles quarreling. Yes, it was the Rigiculm Hotel, the one that occupies the extreme summit, and whose remote little sparkle of lights we had often seen glinting high aloft among the stars from our balcony away down yonder in Lucerne. The crusty portier and the crusty clerks gave us the surly reception which their kind deal out in prosperous times, but by mollifying them with an extra display of obsequiousness and servility, we finally got them to show us to the room which our boy had engaged for us. We got into some dry clothing, and while our supper was preparing, we loafed forsakenly through a couple of vast cavernous drawing rooms, one of which had a stove in it. This stove was in a corner and densely walled around with people. We could not get near the fire, so we moved at large in the Arctic spaces, among a multitude of people who sat silent, smileless, forlorn, and shivering, thinking what fools they were to come, perhaps. There were some Americans and some Germans, but one could see that the great majority were English. We lounged into an apartment where there was a great crowd to see what was going on. It was a memento magazine. The tourists were eagerly buying all sorts and styles of paper cutters, marked souvenir of the Rigi, with handles made of the little curved horn of the ostensible chamois. There were all manner of wooden goblets and such things, similarly marked. I was going to buy a paper cutter, but I believed I could remember the cold comfort of the Rigiculm without it, so I smothered the impulse. Supper warmed us, and we went immediately to bed. But first, as Mr. Baedeker requests all tourists to call his attention to any errors which they may find in his guidebooks, I dropped him a line to inform him he missed it by just about 3 days. I had previously informed him of his mistake about the distance from Allerheiligen to Oppenau, and had also informed the Ordnance Department of the German government of the same error in the imperial maps. I will add here that I never got any answer to those letters or any thanks from either of those sources, and what is still more discourteous, these corrections have not been made, either in the maps or the guidebooks. But I will write again when I get time, for my letters may have miscarried. We curled up in the clammy beds and went to sleep without rocking. We were so sodden with fatigue that we never stirred nor turned over till the blooming blasts of the Alpine horn aroused us. It may well be imagined that we did not lose any time. We snatched on a few odds and ends of clothing, cocooned ourselves in the proper red blankets, and plunged along the halls and out into the whistling wind bareheaded. We saw a tall wooden scaffolding on the very peak of the summit, 100 yards away, and made for it. We rushed up the stairs to the top of this scaffolding and stood there above the vast outlying world, with hair flying and ruddy blankets waving and cracking in the fierce breeze. 15 minutes too late at last, said Harris in a vexed voice. The sun is clear above the horizon. No matter, I said, it is a most magnificent spectacle, and we will see it do the rest of its rising anyway. In a moment, we were deeply absorbed in the marvel before us, and dead to everything else. The great cloud-barred disk of the sun stood just above a limitless expanse of tossing white caps, so to speak, a billowy chaos of massy mountain domes and peaks draped in imperishable snow, and flooded with an opaline glory of changing and dissolving splendors, while through rifts in a black cloudbank above the sun, radiating lances of diamond dust shot to the zenith. The cloven valleys of the lower world swam in a tinted mist which veiled the ruggedness of their crags and ribs and ragged forests, and turned all the forbidding region into a soft and rich and sensuous paradise. We could not speak, we could hardly breathe, we could only gaze in drunken ecstasy and drink in it. Presently Harris exclaimed, "Why, nation, it's going down." Perfectly true, we had missed the morning hornblow and slept all day. This was stupefying. Harris said, "Look here, the sun isn't the spectacle, it's us, stacked up here on top of this gallows, in these idiotic blankets, and 250 well-dressed men and women down here gawking up at us, and not caring a straw whether the sun rises or sets, as long as they've got such a ridiculous spectacle as this to set down in their memorandum books. They seem to be laughing their ribs loose, and there's one girl there that appears to be going all to pieces. I never saw such a man as you before. I think you are the very last possibility in the way of an ass." "What have I done?" I answered with heat. "What have you done? You've got up at 7:30 in the evening to see the sun rise. That's what you've done. And have you done any better, I'd like to know? I've always used to get up with the lark, till I came under the petrifying influence of your turgid intellect." "You used to get up with the lark? Oh, no doubt, you'll get up with the hangman one of these days. But you ought to be ashamed to be joying here like this, in a red blanket, on a 40-foot scaffold on top of the Alps. And no end of people down here to boot. This isn't any place for an exhibition of temper." And so the customary quarrel went on. When the sun was fairly down, we slipped back to the hotel in the charitable gloaming and went to bed again. We had encountered the hornblower on the way, and he had tried to collect compensation, not only for announcing the sunset, which we did see, but for the sunrise, which we had totally missed. But we said no, we only took our solar rations on the European plan, pay for what you get. He promised to make us hear his horn in the morning, if we were alive. Chapter 29. Looking west for sunrise. He kept his word. We heard his horn and instantly got up. It was dark and cold and wretched. As I fumbled around for the matches, knocking things down with my quaking hands, I wished the sun would rise in the middle of the day, when it was warm and bright and cheerful, and one wasn't sleepy. We proceeded to dress by the gloom of a couple sickly candles, but we could hardly button anything, our hands shook so. I thought of how many happy people there were in Europe, Asia, and America, and everywhere, who were sleeping peacefully in their beds, and did not have to get up and see the riggy sunrise. People who did not appreciate their advantage, as like as not, but would get up in the morning, wanting more boons of Providence. While thinking these thoughts, I yawned in a rather ample way, and my upper teeth got hitched on a nail over the door, and while I was mounting a chair to free myself, Harris drew the window curtain and said, "Oh, this is luck. We shan't have to go out at all. Yonder are the mountains in full view." That was glad news, indeed. It made us cheerful right away. One could see the grand alpine masses dimly outlined against the black firmament, and one or two faint stars blinking through rifts in the night. Fully clothed and wrapped in blankets, and huddled ourselves up by the window with lighted pipes, and fell into chat, while we waited in exceeding comfort to see how an alpine sunrise was going to look by candlelight. By and by a delicate, spiritual sort of effulgence spread itself by imperceptible degrees over the loftiest altitudes of the snowy wastes, but there the effort seemed to stop. I said, presently, "There is a hitch about this sunrise somewhere. It doesn't seem to go. What do you reckon is the matter with it?" "I don't know. It appears to hang fire somewhere. I never saw a sunrise act like that before. Can it be that the hotel is playing anything on us?" "Of course not. The hotel merely has a property interest in the sun. It has nothing to do with the management of it. It is a precarious kind of property, too. A succession of total eclipses would probably ruin this tavern. Now what can be the matter with this sunrise?" Harris jumped up and said, "I've got it. I know what's the matter with it. "We've been looking at the place where the sun set last night." "It is perfectly true. Why couldn't you have thought of that sooner? Now we've lost another one, and all through your blundering. It was exactly like you to light a pipe and sit down to wait for the sun to rise in the west." "It was exactly like me to find out the mistake, too. You never would have found it out. I find out all the mistakes. You make them all, too, else your most valuable faculty would be wasted on you. But don't stop to quarrel. Now, maybe we are not too late yet." But we were. The sun was well up when we got to the exhibition ground. On our way up, we met the crowd returning, men and women dressed in all sorts of queer costumes, and exhibiting all degrees of cold and wretchedness in their gaits and countenances. A dozen still remained on the ground when we reached there, huddled together about the scaffold with their backs to the bitter wind. They had their red guidebooks open at the diagram of the view and were painfully picking out the several mountains and trying to impress their names and positions on their memories. It was one of the saddest sights I ever saw. Two sides of this place were guarded by railings to keep people from being blown over the precipices. The view, looking sheer down into the broad valley eastward from this great elevation, almost a perpendicular mile, was very quaint and curious. Counties, towns, hilly ribs and ridges, wide stretches of green meadow, great forest tracts, winding streams, a dozen blue lakes, a block of busy steamboats. We saw all this little world in unique circumstantiality of detail, saw it just as the birds see it, and all reduced to the smallest of scales, and as sharply worked out and finished as a steel engraving. The numerous toy villages, with tiny spires projecting out of them, were just as the children might have left them when done with play the day before. The forest tracks were diminished to cushions of moss. One or two big lakes were dwarfed to ponds, the smaller ones too. Puddles, though they did not look like puddles, but like blue teardrops which had fallen and lodged in slight depressions, conformable to their shapes, among the moss beds and the smooth levels of dainty green farmland. The microscopic steamboats glided along as in a city reservoir, taking a mighty time to cover the distance between ports, which seemed only a yard apart, and the isthmus which separated two lakes looked as if one might stretch out on it and lie with both elbows in the water. Yet we knew invisible wagons were toiling across it and finding the distance a tedious one. This beautiful miniature world had exactly the appearance of those relief maps, which reproduce nature precisely, with the heights and depressions and other details graduated to a reduced scale, and with the rocks, trees, lakes, etc., colored after nature. I believed we could walk down to Wiegies or Wittznau in a day, but I knew we could go down by rail in about an hour, so I chose the latter method. I wanted to see what it was like anyway. The train came along about the middle of the afternoon, and an odd thing it was. The locomotive boilers stood on end, and it and the whole locomotive were tilted sharply backward. There were two passenger cars, roofed, but wide open all around. These cars were not tilted back, but the seats were. This enables the passenger to sit level while going down a steep incline. There are 3 railway tracks. The central one is cogged. The lantern wheel of the engine grips its way along these cogs and pulls the train up the hill or retards its motion on the down trip. About the same speed, 3 miles an hour, is maintained both ways. Whether going up or down, the locomotive is always at the lower end of the train. It pushes in the one case, braces back in the other. The passenger rides backward going up and faces forward going down. We got front seats, and while the train moved along about 50 yards on level ground, I was not the least frightened. But now it started abruptly downstairs and I caught my breath, and I, like my neighbors, unconsciously held back all I could and threw my weight to the rear, but of course that did no particular good. I had slidden down the balusters when I was a boy and thought nothing of it, but to slide down the balusters in a railway train is a thing to make one's flesh creep. Sometimes we had as much as 10 yards of almost level ground, and this gave us a few full breaths in comfort. But straightway we would turn a corner and see a long steep line of rails stretching down below us, and the comfort was at an end. One expected to see the locomotive pause or slack up a little and approach this plunge cautiously, but it did nothing of the kind. It went calmly on, and when it reached the jumping-off place it made a sudden bow and went gliding smoothly downstairs, untroubled by the circumstances. It was wildly exhilarating to slide along the edge of the precipices after this grisly fashion and look straight down upon that far-off valley which I was describing a while ago. There was no level ground at the Kaltbad station. The railbed was as steep as a roof. I was curious to see how the stop was going to be managed, but it was very simple. The train came sliding down, and when it reached the right spot, it just stopped. That was all there was to it, stopped on the steep incline, and when the exchange of passengers and baggage had been made, it moved off and went sliding down again. The train can be stopped anywhere at a moment's notice. There was one curious effect, which I need not take the trouble to describe, because I can scissor a description of it out of the railway company's advertising pamphlet and save my ink. On the whole tour, particularly at the descent, we undergo an optical illusion which often seems to be incredible. All the shrubs, fir trees, stables, houses, etc. seem to be bent in a slanting direction, as by an immense pressure of air. They are all standing awry, so much awry that the chalets and cottages of the peasants seem to be tumbling down. It is the consequence of the steep inclination of the line. Those who are seated in the carriage do not observe that they are going down a declivity of 20 to 25 degrees, their seats being adapted to this course of proceeding and being bent down at their backs. They mistake their carriage and its horizontal lines for a proper measure of the normal plane, and therefore all the objects outside, which really are in a horizontal position, must show a disproportion of 20 to 25 degrees declivity in regard to the mountain. By the time one reaches Kaltbad, he has acquired confidence in the railway, and he now ceases to try to ease the locomotive by holding back. Thenceforth, he smokes his pipe in serenity and gazes out upon the magnificent picture below and about him with unfettered enjoyment. There is nothing to interrupt the view or the breeze. It is like inspecting the world on the wing. However, to be exact, there is one place where the serenity lapses for a while. This is while one is crossing the Schnurtobel Bridge, a frail structure which swings its gossamer frame down through the dizzy air over a gorge like a vagrant spider strand. One has no difficulty in remembering his sins while the train is creeping down this bridge, and he repents of them, too, though he sees, when he gets to Witznau, that he need not have done it. The bridge was perfectly safe. So ends the eventual trip, which we made to the Riegekulm to see an alpine sunrise. Chapter 30. Harris climbs mountains for me. An hour's sail brought us to Lucerne again. I judged it best to go to bed and rest several days, for I knew that the man who undertakes to make the tour of Europe on foot must take care of himself. Thinking over my plans as mapped out, I perceived that they did not take in the Furka Pass, the Rhone Glacier, the Finsterrarhorn, the Wetterhorn, etc. I immediately examined the guidebook to see if these were important, and found they were. In fact, a pedestrian tour of Europe could not be complete without them. Of course, that decided me at once to see them, for I never allow myself to do things by halves or in a slurring, slipshod way. I called in my agent and instructed him to go without delay and make a careful examination of these noted places on foot and bring me back a written report of the result for insertion in my book. I instructed him to go to Hospenthal as quickly as possible and make his grand start from there, to extend his foot expedition as far as the Giesbach Fall and return to me from thence by diligence or mule. I told him to take the courier with him. He objected to the courier, and with some show of reason, since he was about to venture upon new and untried ground, but I thought he might as well learn how to take care of the courier now as later. Therefore I enforced my point. I said that the trouble, delay, and inconvenience of traveling with a courier were balanced by the deep respect which a courier's presence commands, and I must insist that as much style be thrown into my journeys as possible. So the two assumed complete mountaineering costumes and departed. A week later they returned, pretty well used up, and my agent handed me the following. Official report of a visit to the Furka region. By H. Harris, agent. About 7 o'clock in the morning, with perfectly fine weather, we started from Hospenthal and arrived at the Mason on the Furka in a little under 4 hours. The want of variety in the scenery from Hospenthal made the Kakaponeka wearisome, but let none be discouraged. no one can fail to be completely our recompense for his fatigue when he sees, for the first time, the monarch of the Oberland, the tremendous Finsteraarhorn. A moment before all was dullness, but a pas further has placed us on the summit of the Furka, and exactly in front of us, at a hopow of only 15 miles, this magnificent mountain lifts its snow-wreathed precipices into the deep blue sky. The inferior mountains on each side of the pass form a sort of frame for the picture of their dread lord, and close in the view so completely that no other prominent feature in the Oberland is visible from this bangabang. Nothing withdraws the attention from the solitary grandeur of the Finsteraarhorn and the dependent spurs which form the abutments of the central peak. With the addition of some others, who were also bound for the Grimsel, we formed a large XHV lodge as we descended the steg which winds round the shoulder of a mountain toward the Rhone glacier. We soon left the path and took to the ice, and after wandering amongst the crevices unpew to admire the wonders of these deep blue caverns and hear the rushing of waters through their subglacial channels, we struck out a course toward El Otter Kravas and crossed the glacier successfully, a little above the cave from which the infant Rhone takes its first bound from under the grand precipice of ice. Half a mile below this, we began to climb the flowery side of the Mayenwand. One of our party started before the rest, but the hitzi was so great that we found I am quite exhausted and lying at full length in the shade of a large gestein. We sat down with him for a time, for all felt the heat exceedingly in the climb up this very steep Balwagali, and then we set out again together, and arrived at last near the Dead Man's Lake, at the foot of the Seidelhorn. This lonely spot, once used for an extempore burying place, after a sanguinary battue between the French and Austrians, is the perfection of desolation. There is nothing in sight to mark the hand of man, except the line of weather-beaten whitened posts set up to indicate the direction of the pass in the Odoak of winter. Near this point the footpath joins the wider track, which connects the Grimsel with the head of the Rhone Schnapp. This has been carefully constructed, and leads with a tortuous course among and over Les Piers, down to the bank of the gloomy little Swash, which almost washes against the walls of the Grimsel Hospice. We arrived a little before 4 o'clock at the end of our day's journey, hot enough to justify the step, taken by most of the party, of plunging into the crystal water of the snow-fed lake. The next afternoon we started for a walk up the Unteraar Glacier, with the intention of, at all events, getting as far as the hut, which is used as a sleeping place by most of those who cross the Stralek Pass to Grindelwald. We got over the tedious collection of stones and debris which covers the Pied of the Gletscher, and had walked nearly 3 hours from the Grimsel, when, just as we were thinking of crossing over to the right, to climb the cliffs at the foot of the hut, the clouds, which had for some time assumed a threatening appearance, suddenly dropped, and a huge mass of them, driving toward us from the Finsteraarhorn, poured down a deluge of habulong and hail. Fortunately, we were not far from a very large glacier table. It was a huge rock balanced on a pedestal of ice high enough to admit of our all creeping under it for Gaukarak. A stream of Puckatipuk had furrowed a course for itself in the ice at its base, and we were obliged to stand with one fuss on each side of this, and endeavor to keep ourselves show by cutting steps in the steep bank of the pedestal, so as to get a higher place for standing on as the Wasser rose rapidly in its trench. A very cold bzzzzzzzzz accompanied the storm and made our position far from pleasant, and presently came a flash of Blitzen, apparently in the middle of our little party, with an instantaneous clap of Yaki, sounding like a large gun fired close to our ears. The effect was startling, but in a few seconds our attention was fixed by the roaring echoes of the thunder against the tremendous mountains which completely surrounded us. This was followed by many more bursts, none of which, however, was so dangerously near, and after waiting a long demi-hour in our icy prison, we sallied out to talk through a habulong which, though not so heavy as before, was quite enough to give us a thorough soaking before our arrival at the hospice. The Grimsel is certainly a wonderful place, situated at the bottom of a sort of huge crater, the sides of which are utterly savage geberge, composed of barren rocks which cannot even support a single pine arbor, and afford only scanty food for a herd of GMWKW Alp. It looks as if it must be completely begraben in the winter snows. Enormous avalanches fall against it every spring, sometimes covering everything to the depth of 30 or 40 feet. And in spite of walls 4 feet thick and furnished with outside shutters, the two men who stay here when the voyageurs are snugly quartered in their distant homes can tell you that the snow sometimes shakes the house to its foundations. Next morning, the hoggle-bumgle-up still continued bad, but we made up our minds to go on and make the best of it. Half an hour after we started, the region thickened unpleasantly, and we attempted to get shelter under a projecting rock, but being far too nass already to make standing at all agreeable, we pushed on for the handdeck, consoling ourselves with the reflection that from the furious rushing of the river Aar at our side, we should at all events see the celebrated Wasserfall in grand perfection. Nor were we nappersocket in our expectation. The water was roaring down its leap of 250 feet in a most magnificent frenzy, while the trees which cling to its rocky sides swayed to and fro in the violence of the hurricane which it brought down with it. Even the stream, which falls into the main cascade at right angles and toutefois forms a beautiful feature in the scene, was now swollen into a raging torrent, and the violence of this meeting of the waters, about 50 feet below the frail bridge where we stood, was fearfully grand. While we were looking at it, as a gleam of sunshine came out, and instantly a beautiful rainbow was formed by the spray and hung in midair suspended over the awful gorge. On going into the chalet above the fall, we were informed that a brook had broken down near Göttingen, and that it would be impossible to proceed for some time. Accordingly, we were kept in our drenched condition for eine Stunde, when some voyageurs arrived from Meringen and told us that there had been a trifling accident, a burr that we could now cross. On arriving at the spot, I was much inclined to suspect that the whole story was a ruse to make us sloke and drink the more at the Handdeck Inn, for only a few planks had been carried away, and though there might perhaps have been some difficulty with mules, the gap was certainly not larger than a MMBGLX might cross with a very slight leap. Near Göttingen, the Habulong happily ceased, and we had time to walk ourselves tolerably dry before arriving at Reichenbach, so we enjoyed a good diner at the Hotel des Alps. Next morning we walked to Rosenloy, the beau ideal of Swiss scenery, where we spent the middle of the day in an excursion to the glacier. This was more beautiful than words can describe, for in the constant progress of the ice, it has changed the form of its extremity and formed a vast cavern as blue as the sky above and rippled like a frozen ocean. A few steps cut in the Whoopchambori enabled us to walk completely under this and feast our eyes upon one of the loveliest objects in creation. The glacier was all around divided by numberless fissures of the same exquisite color, and the finest wooded birren were growing in abundance but a few yards from the ice. The inn stands in a charmant spot close to the Quai de la Riviera, which, lower down, forms the Reichenbach Fall and embosomed in the richest of pine woods, while the fine form of the Wellhorn looking down upon it completes the enchanting Boppel. In the afternoon, we walked over the great Schädeck to Grindelwald, stopping to pay a visit to the upper glacier by the way. But we were again overtaken by bad hoggle-bumgle-up and arrived at the hotel in a such a state that the landlord's wardrobe was in great request. The clouds by this time seemed to have done their worst, for a lovely day succeeded, which we determined to devote to an ascent of the Fallhorn. We left Grindelwald just as a thunderstorm was dying away, and we hoped to find Gütenwetter up above. But the rain, which had nearly ceased, began again, and we were struck by the rapidly increasing Freud as we ascended. 2/3 of the way up were completed when the rain was exchanged for nilic, with which the Boden was thickly covered, and before we arrived at the top, the nilic and mist became so thick that we could not see one another at more than 20 pupu distance, and it became difficult to pick our way over the rough and thickly covered ground. Shivering with cold, we turned into bed with a double allowance of clothes and slept comfortably while the wind howled au heure de la maison. When I awoke, the wall and the window looked equally dark, but in another hour I found I could just see the form of the latter. So I jumped out of bed and forced it open, though with great difficulty from the frost and the quantities of nilic heaped up against it. A row of huge icicles hung down from the edge of the roof, and anything more wintry than the whole Anblick could not well be imagined. But the sudden appearance of the great mountains in front was so startling that I felt no inclination to move toward bed again. The snow which had collected upon La Fenêtre had increased the finsternis oder der Dunkelheit, so that when I looked out, I was surprised to find that the daylight was considerable, and that the Bauraguma would evidently rise before long. Only the brightest of les étoiles were still shining. The sky was cloudless overhead, though small curling mists lay thousands of feet below us in the valleys, wreathed around the feet of the mountains, and adding to the splendor of their lofty summits. We were soon dressed and out of the house, watching the gradual approach of dawn, thoroughly absorbed in the first near view of the Oberland giants, which broke upon us unexpectedly after the intense obscurity of the evening before. Kabagwako songwashi come Wetterhorn Snoppo, cried someone, as that grand summit gleamed with the first rose of dawn, and in a few moments the double crest of the Schreckhorn followed its example. Peak after peak seemed warmed with life, the Jungfrau blushed even more beautifully than her neighbors, and soon, from the Wetterhorn in the east to the Wildstrubel in the west, a long row of fires glowed upon mighty altars, truly worthy of the gods. The WLGW was very severe. Our sleeping place could hardly be distingué from the snow around it, which had fallen to a depth of a fluke during the past evening, and we heartily enjoyed a rough scramble en bas to the Giesbach Falls, where we soon found a warm climate. At noon the day before Grindelwald, the thermometer could not have stood at less than 100 degrees far. In the sun, and in the evening, judging from the icicles formed and the state of the windows, there must have been at least 12 dingblatter of frost, thus giving a change of 80 degrees during a few hours. I said, "You have done well, Harris. This report is concise, compact, well expressed. The language is crisp. The descriptions are vivid and not needlessly elaborated. Your report goes straight to the point, attends strictly to business, and doesn't fool around. It is in many ways an excellent document, but it has a fault. It is too learned, it is much too learned." What is dingblatter? Dingblatter is a Fiji word meaning degrees. You knew the English of it then? Oh, yes. What is nillik? That is the Eskimo term for snow. So you knew the English for that too? Why, certainly. What does MMBGLX stand for? That is Zulu for pedestrian. While the form of the Wellhorn looking down upon it completes the enchanting bopple. What is bopple? Picture it's Choctaw. What is Schnapp? Valley, that is Choctaw also. What is Balwagali? That is Chinese for hill. Kakaponeka. Ascent, Choctaw. But we were again overtaken by bad Hogglebumgalup. What does Hogglebumgalup mean? That is Chinese for weather. Is Hogglebumgalup better than the English word? Is it any more descriptive? No, it means just the same. And dingblatter and nillik and bopple and schnapp, are they better than the English words? No, they mean just what the English ones do. Then why do you use them? Why have you used all this Chinese and Choctaw and Zulu rubbish? Because I didn't know any French but 2 or 3 words, and I didn't know any Latin or Greek at all. That is nothing. Why should you want to use foreign words anyhow? They adorn my page, they all do it. Who is all? Everybody that writes elegantly. Anybody has a right to that wants to. I think you are mistaken. I then proceeded in the following scathing manner. When really learned men write books for other learned men to read, they are justified in using as many learned words as they please. Their audience will understand them. But a man who writes a book for the general public to read is not justified in disfiguring his pages with untranslated foreign expressions. It is an insolence toward the majority of the purchasers, for it is a very frank and impudent way of saying, "Get the translations made yourself if you want them. This book is not written for the ignorant classes." There are men who know a foreign language so well and have used it so long in their daily life that they seem to discharge whole volleys of it into their English writings unconsciously, and so they omit to translate as much as half the time. That is a great cruelty to 9 out of 10 of the man's readers. What is the excuse for this? The writer would say he only uses the foreign language where the delicacy of his point cannot be conveyed in English. Very well, then he writes his best things for the 10th man, and he ought to warn the 9 other not to buy his book. However, the excuse he offers is at least an excuse. But there is another set of men who are like you. They know a word here and there of a foreign language, or a few beggarly little 3-word phrases filched from the back of the dictionary, and these are continually peppering into their literature with a pretense of knowing that language. What excuse can they offer? The foreign words and phrases which they use have their exact equivalents in a nobler language, English. Yet they think they adorn their page when they say Strasse for street and Bahnhof for railway station, and so on, flaunting these fluttering rags of poverty in the reader's face and imagining he will be ass enough to take them for the sign of untold riches held in reserve. I will let your learning remain in your report. You have as much right, I suppose, to adorn your page with Zulu and Chinese and Choctaw rubbish as others of your sort have to adorn theirs with insolent odds and ends smouched from half a dozen learned tongues whose abs they don't even know. When the musing spider steps upon the red-hot shovel, he first exhibits a wild surprise, then he shrivels up. Similar was the effect of these blistering words upon the tranquil and unsuspecting agent. I can be dreadfully rough on a person when the mood takes me. Chapter 31. Alpscaling by Carriage. We now prepared for a considerable walk from Lucerne to Interlaken over the Brunig Pass. But at the last moment, the weather was so good that I changed my mind and hired a 4-horse carriage. It was a huge vehicle, roomy, as easy in its motion as a palanquin, and exceedingly comfortable. We got away pretty early in the morning, after a hot breakfast, and went bowling over a hard, smooth road through the summer loveliness of Switzerland, with near and distant lakes and mountains before and about us for the entertainment of the eye, and the music of multitudinous birds to charm the ear. Sometimes there was only the width of the road between the imposing precipices on the right and the clear, cool water on the left, with its shoals of uncatchable fish skimming about through the bars of sun and shadow. And sometimes, in place of the precipices, the grassy land stretched away in an apparently endless upward slant and was dotted everywhere with snug little chalets, the peculiarly captivating cottage of Switzerland. The ordinary chalet turns a broad, honest gable end to the road, and its ample roof hovers over the home in a protecting, caressing way, projecting its sheltering eaves far outward. The quaint windows are filled with little panes and garnished with white muslin curtains and brightened with boxes of blooming flowers. Across the front of the house, and up the spreading eaves and along the fanciful railings of the shallow porch, are elaborate carvings, wreaths, fruits, arabesques, verses from scripture, names, dates, etc. The building is wholly of wood, reddish-brown in tint, a very pleasing color. It generally has vines climbing over it. Set such a house against the fresh green of the hillside, and it looks ever so cozy and inviting and picturesque, and is a decidedly graceful addition to the landscape. One does not find out what a hold the chalet has taken upon him until he presently comes upon a new house, a house which is aping the town fashions of Germany and France, a prim, hideous, straight up-and-down thing, plastered all over on the outside to look like stone, and altogether so stiff and formal and ugly and forbidding, and so out of tune with the gracious landscape, and so deaf and dumb and dead to the poetry of its surroundings, that it suggests an undertaker at a picnic, a corpse at a wedding, a Puritan in paradise. In the course of the morning, we passed the spot where Pontius Pilate is said to have thrown himself into the lake. The legend goes that after the crucifixion his conscience troubled him, and he fled from Jerusalem and wandered about the earth, weary of life and a prey to tortures of the mind. Eventually, he hid himself away on the heights of Mount Pilatus and dwelt alone among the clouds and crags for years, but rest and peace were still denied him, so he finally put an end to his misery by drowning himself. Presently we passed the place where a man of better odor was born. This was the children's friend, Santa Claus, or Saint Nicholas. There are some unaccountable reputations in the world. This saint's is an instance. He has ranked for ages as the peculiar friend of children, yet it appears he was not much of a friend to his own. He had 10 of them, and when 50 years old he left them, and sought out as dismal a refuge from the world as possible, and became a hermit in order that he might reflect upon pious themes without being disturbed by the joyous and other noises from the nursery, doubtless. Judging by Pilate and St. Nicholas, there exists no rule for the construction of hermits. They seem made out of all kinds of material. But Pilate attended to the matter of expiating his sin while he was alive, whereas St. Nicholas will probably have to go on climbing down sooty chimneys, Christmas Eve, forever, and conferring kindness on other people's children, to make up for deserting his own. His bones are kept in a church in a village, Satseln, which we visited, and are naturally held in great reverence. His portrait is common in the farmhouses of the region, but is believed by many to be but an indifferent likeness. During his hermit life, according to legend, he partook of the bread and wine of the communion once a month, but all the rest of the month he fasted. A constant marvel with us, as we sped along the bases of the steep mountains on this journey, was not that avalanches occur, but that they are not occurring all the time. One does not understand why rocks and landslides do not plunge down these declivities daily. A landslip occurred 3/4 of a century ago on the route from Arth to Brunnen, which was a formidable thing. A massive conglomerate 2 miles long, 1,000 feet broad, and 100 feet thick, broke away from a cliff 3,000 feet high and hurled itself into the valley below, burying 4 villages and 500 people, as in a grave. We had such a beautiful day, and such endless pictures of limpid lakes, and green hills and valleys, and majestic mountains, and milky cataracts dancing down the steeps and gleaming in the sun, that we could not help feeling sweet toward all the world. So we tried to drink all the milk, and eat all the grapes and apricots and berries, and buy all the bouquets of wild flowers which the little peasant boys and girls offered for sale. But we had to retire from this contract, for it was too heavy. At short distances, and they were entirely too short, all along the road, were groups of neat and comely children, with their wares nicely and temptingly set forth in the grass under the shade trees, and as soon as we approached they swarmed into the road, holding out their baskets and milk bottles, and ran beside the carriage, barefoot and bareheaded, and importuned us to buy. They seldom desisted early, but continued to run and insist, beside the wagon while they could, and behind it until they lost breath. Then they turned and chased a returning carriage back to their trading post again. After several hours of this, without any intermission, it becomes almost annoying. I do not know what we should have done without the returning carriages to draw off the pursuit. However, there were plenty of these, loaded with dusty tourists and piled high with luggage. Indeed, from Lucerne to Interlaken, we had the spectacle, among other scenery, of an unbroken procession of fruit peddlers and tourists' carriages. Our talk was mostly anticipatory of what we should see on the downgrade of the Brunig by and by, after we should pass the summit. All our friends in Lucerne had said that to look down upon Meringen and the rushing blue-gray river Aar and the broad level green valley, and across at the mighty alpine precipices that rise straight up to the clouds out of that valley, and up at the microscopic chalets perched upon the dizzy eaves of those precipices and winking dimly and fitfully through the drifting veil of vapor, and still up and up at the superb Oldsgebach and the other beautiful cascades that leap from those rugged heights, robed in powdery spray, ruffled with foam, and girdled with rainbows. To look upon these things, they say, was to look upon the last possibility of the sublime and the enchanting. Therefore, as I say, we talked mainly of these coming wonders. If we were conscious of any impatience, it was to get there in favorable season. If we felt any anxiety, it was that the day might remain perfect and enable us to see those marvels at their best. As we approached the Kaiserstuhl, a part of the harness gave way. We were in distress for a moment, but only a moment. It was the fore and aft gear that was broken, the thing that leads aft from the forward part of the horse and is made fast to the thing that pulls the wagon. In America, this would have been a heavy leathern strap, but all over the continent it is nothing but a piece of rope the size of your little finger. Clothesline is what it is. Cabs use it, private carriages, freight carts and wagons, all sorts of vehicles have it. In Munich, I afterwards saw it used on a long wagon laden with 54 half-barrels of beer. I had before noticed that the cabs in Heidelberg used it, not new rope, but rope that had been in use since Abraham's time, and I had felt nervous, sometimes behind it when the cab was tearing down a hill, but I had long been accustomed to it now and had even become afraid of the leather strap which belonged in its place. Our driver got a fresh piece of clothesline out of his locker and repaired the brake in 2 minutes. So much for one European fashion. Every country has its own ways. It may interest the reader to know how they put horses to on the continent. The man stands up the horses on each side of the thing that projects from the front end of the wagon, and then throws the tangled mess of gear forward through a ring, and hauls it aft, and passes the other thing through the other ring, and hauls it aft on the other side of the other horse, opposite to the first one, after crossing them and bringing the loose end back, and then buckles the other thing underneath the horse, and takes another thing and wraps it around the thing I spoke of before, and puts another thing over each horse's head, with broad flappers to it to keep the dust out of his eyes, and puts the iron thing in his mouth for him to grit his teeth on, uphill, and brings the ends of these things aft over his back, after buckling another one around under his neck to hold his head up, and hitching another thing on a thing that goes over his shoulders to keep his head up when he is climbing a hill, and then takes the slack of the thing which I mentioned a while ago and fetches it aft and makes it fast to the thing that pulls the wagon, and hands the other things up to the driver to steer with. I never have buckled up a horse myself, but I do not think we do it that way. We had 4 very handsome horses, and the driver was very proud of his turnout. He would bowl along on a reasonable trot on the highway, but when he entered a village, he did it on a furious run, and accompanied it with a frenzy of ceaseless whip-crackings that sounded like volleys of musketry. He tore through the narrow streets and around the sharp curves like a moving earthquake, showering his volleys as he went, and before him swept a continuous tidal wave of scampering children, ducks, cats, and mothers clasping babies which they had snatched out of the way of the coming destruction. And as this living wave washed aside, along the walls, its elements, being safe, forgot their fears and turned their admiring gaze upon that gallant driver till he thundered around the next curve and was lost to sight. He was a great man to those villagers, with his gaudy clothes and his terrific ways. Whenever he stopped to have his cattle watered and fed with loaves of bread, the villagers stood around admiring him while he swaggered about. The little boys gazed up at his face with humble homage, and the landlord brought out foaming mugs of beer and conversed proudly with him while he drank. Then he mounted his lofty box, swung his explosive whip, and away he went again, like a storm. I had not seen anything like this before since I was a boy, and the stage used to flourish the village with the dust flying and the horn tooting. When we reached the base of the Kaiserstuhl, we took 2 more horses. We had to toil along with difficulty for an hour and a half or 2 hours, for the ascent was not very gradual, but when we passed the backbone and approached the station, the driver surpassed all his previous efforts in the way of rush and clatter. He could not have 6 horses all the time, so he made the most of his chance while he had it. Up to this point we had been in the heart of the William Tell region. The hero is not forgotten by any means or held in doubtful veneration. His wooden image, with his bow drawn above the doors of taverns, was a frequent feature of the scenery. About noon we arrived at the foot of the Brunig Pass and made a 2-hour stop at the village hotel, another of those clean, pretty, and thoroughly well-kept inns which are such an astonishment to people who are accustomed to hotels of a dismally different pattern in remote country towns. There was a lake here, in the lap of the great mountains. The green slopes that rose toward the lower crags were graced with scattered Swiss cottages nestling among miniature farms and gardens, and from out a leafy ambuscade in the upper heights tumbled a brawling cataract. Carriage after carriage, laden with tourists and trunks, arrived, and the quiet hotel was soon populous. We were early at the table d'hôte and saw the people all come in. There were 25, perhaps. They were of various nationalities, but we were the only Americans. Next to me sat an English bride, and next to her sat her new husband, whom she called Neddy, though he was big enough and stalwart enough to be entitled to his full name. They had a pretty little lovers' quarrel over what wine they should have. Neddy was for obeying the guidebook and taking the wine of the country, but the bride said, "What that nasty stuff?" "It isn't nasty, pet, it's quite good." It is nasty. No, it isn't nasty. It's awful nasty, Neddy, and I shan't drink it. Then the question was, what she must have. She said he knew very well that she never drank anything but champagne. She added, "You know very well Papa always has champagne on his table, and I've always been used to it." Neddy made a playful pretense of being distressed about the expense, and this amused her so much that she nearly exhausted herself with laughter, and this pleased him so much that he repeated his jest a couple of times and added new and killing varieties to it. When the bride finally recovered, she gave Neddy a love box on the arm with her fan and said with arch severity, "Well, you would have me, nothing else would do, so you'll have to make the best of a bad bargain. Do order the champagne, I'm awful dry." So with a mock groan which made her laugh again, Neddy ordered the champagne. The fact that this young woman had never moistened the selvage edge of her soul with a less plebeian tipple than champagne had a marked and subduing effect on Harris. He believed she belonged to the royal family, but I had my doubts. We heard 2 or 3 different languages spoken by people at the table and guessed out the nationalities of most of the guests to our satisfaction, but we failed with an elderly gentleman and his wife and a young girl who sat opposite us, and with a gentleman of about 35 who sat 3 seats beyond Harris. We did not hear any of these speak. But finally the last-named gentleman left while we were not noticing, but we looked up as he reached the far end of the table. He stopped there a moment and made his toilet with a pocket comb. So he was a German, or else he had lived in German hotels long enough to catch the fashion. When the elderly couple and the young girl rose to leave, they bowed respectfully to us. So they were Germans too. This national custom is worth 6 of the other one for export. After dinner, we talked with several Englishmen, and they inflamed our desire to a hotter degree than ever to see the sights of Meiringen from the heights of the Brunig Pass. They said the view was marvelous, and that one who had seen it once could never forget it. They also spoke of the romantic nature of the road over the pass, and how in one place it had been cut through a flank of the solid rock, in such a way that the mountain overhung the tourist as he passed by. And they furthermore said that the sharp turns in the road and the abruptness of the descent would afford us a thrilling experience, for we should go down in a flying gallop and seem to be spinning around the rings of a whirlwind, like a drop of whiskey descending the spirals of a corkscrew. I got all the information out of these gentlemen that we could need, and then, to make everything complete, I asked them if a body could get hold of a little fruit and milk here and there in case of necessity. They threw up their hands in speechless intimation that the road was simply paved with refreshment peddlers. We were impatient to get away now, and the rest of our 2-hour stop rather dragged. But finally, the set time arrived, and we began the ascent. Indeed, it was a wonderful road. It was smooth and compact and clean, and the side next the precipices was guarded all along by dressed stone posts about 3 feet high, placed at short distances apart. The road could not have been better built if Napoleon I had built it. He seems to have been the introducer of the sort of roads which Europe now uses. All literature which describes life as it existed in England, France, and Germany up to the close of the last century is filled with pictures of coaches and carriages wallowing through these 3 countries in mud and slush half-wheel deep. But after Napoleon had floundered through a conquered kingdom, he generally arranged things so that the rest of the world could follow dryshod. We went on climbing higher and higher and curving hither and thither in the shade of noble woods, and with a rich variety and profusion of wild flowers all about us, and glimpses of rounded grassy backbones below us occupied by trim chalets and nibbling sheep, and other glimpses of far lower altitudes, where distance diminished the chalets to toys and obliterated the sheep altogether, and every now and then some ermined monarch of the Alps swung magnificently into view for a moment, then drifted past an intervening spur and disappeared again. It was an intoxicating trip altogether. The exceeding sense of satisfaction that follows a good dinner added largely to the enjoyment. The having something especial to look forward to and muse about, like the approaching grandeurs of Meiringen, sharpened the zest. Smoking was never so good before, solid comfort was never solider. We lay back against the thick cushions silent, meditative, steeped in felicity. I rubbed my eyes, opened them, and started. I had been dreaming I was at sea, and it was a thrilling surprise to wake up and find land all around me. It took me a couple seconds to come to, as you may say, then I took in the situation. The horses were drinking at a trough in the edge of a town, the driver was taking beer, Harris was snoring at my side. The courier, with folded arms and bowed head, was sleeping on the box. 24 barefooted and bareheaded children were gathered about the carriage, with their hands crossed behind, gazing up with serious and innocent admiration at the dozing tourists baking there in the sun. Several small girls held night-capped babies nearly as big as themselves in their arms, and even these fat babies seemed to take a sort of sluggish interest in us.